The Board of Behavioral Sciences Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. Today is April 5th, 2019, and the time is 9:06 a.m. So Christina, would you help us establish a quorum?
Good morning. Christina Wong,
Here.
Betty Conley. Here. Jonathan Maddox.
Here.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. So let's move on to have an introduction. So I will start with up to my right. So Steve.
Steven Sodergren, Assistant Executive Officer with the board.
Kim Madsen, Executive Officer for the board.
Christina Wong, LCSW member.
Sabina Knight, Legal Counsel.
Betty Conley, LEP member.
Jonathan Maddox, LMFT member.
Christine Whitlisbach, public member.
Roseanne Helms, Legislative Analyst for the board.
Christy Berger, Regulatory Analyst for the board.
Thank you. So for the public, if you're willing, your introduction is voluntary. And if you want to give an introduction, please share your name and your organization. And please come up to the podium.
Jan Lee Wong, National Association of Social Workers. Good morning.
Jerry Grossman Seminars.
Kenneth Edwards, California Association for LPCCs.
Heidi Holmblad, California Association of School Psychologists.
Maya Nahar with the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists.
Chris Jones, California Association of School Psychologists.
Vinoda Jolie, I'm representing myself. I'm a LMFT in private practice.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to the next agenda item, and that's the approval of the February 8th, 2019 committee meeting minutes, and it's on a separate material. So any question, any discussion? Approval? I need a motion.
I'll move to approve.
I'll second that. So any other discussion? Okay, so we're ready to vote?
Okay, Christina Wong,
Yes.
Betty Conley.
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So let's start with, now we will move on to our discussion of the bills. So the first one is AB 184, and that's about the BBS registrants and licensees. And Roseanne?
Yes, so our first bill up today is AB 184 by Assemblymember Mathis. This bill requires the board to offer its applicants, registrants, and licensees the option of keeping their home address confidential. So current law requires certain boards under DCA to disclose information about the licensees on the internet, including an address of record. It specifies that the entity must allow the licensee to provide a post office box number or another alternate address as the address of record in lieu of a home address if they don't wish to provide it. So the author states that through the requirement of a personal home address being made public knowledge, therapists and social workers under the BBS must live in a state of fear and concern. And then so they go on to state they're running this bill to try to alleviate the problem. The problem is that it's incorrect what they're stating. Our board requires its licensees to either provide a home address or they can provide an alternate address. It can be a post office box if they'd like. They can also provide a secondary address that's a work address or a business address. So they're not forced to provide their home address. They have an option of providing an alternate address. The law doesn't specify what that alternate address is. So they could choose to rent a post office box, but they could choose to provide a different address as well. The address of record is important because it allows the public, if they had litigation or wanted to contact an old therapist for records, they need to be able to have some way of reaching them. So that's why we asked for the address of record. It's not just specific to this board. Most other DCA boards have that requirement, if not all of them. So in terms of where this bill is, it was scheduled to be heard at the Assembly Business and Professions Committee this past Monday. The author held it. because the committee analysis raised these very concerns and then some. So I don't know what the future of this bill is, but for now we have to assume that it's moving forward as written.
So my question is that, have we ever have any complaint from our licensees or registrant that, that the requirement of disclosing a home address is problematic?
We've had some concerns raised with that. But when we explained to them that the law does not require their home address, but we do need an address of record so that we can contact them for, any type of formal board communication. And we provide the alternatives of a PO box. We provide the alternative of a worksite address. But when we talk about PO boxes, we specifically, at least I specifically inform them that will be your address of record, and you would be responsible for checking that PO box for any formal communication that the board sends you. So, yeah, but it's rare. I mean, I get a handful of them.
And the application doesn't say home address, it says an address of records. We're not telling people, oh, you have to provide your home address.
So I have a question. So how it works now, sorry. Sorry. Is it possible to give your licensing board your home address so you get all your stuff from the licensing board from the home and have the public see a different address?
I don't think so, because when we enter the address of record in Breeze, that first address, that's where everything goes. They pull from that to put that on the internet.
I mean, just as a licensee for another board, I mean, it's problematic for me because what if someone...
I completely understand the concern, yeah.
But I understand the concern, like we have to have communication with the board and people need to know where to find us, but it seems like there ought to be another way. I don't know, I just don't like my home address out there.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't have my home address either, so I actually, for my license, I give my office address, which is actually a lot more official too.
Well,
because it is about, the business.
It's not more efficient when you're wanting your communication from the board to come through work, because I work for a large medical center. It could be 2 weeks before I get that mail, or maybe never if it gets lost, which happens a lot. So I can see it would be problematic for people.
Right.
Yeah.
I think Roseanne pointed out, I mean, the conflict that this bill creates with existing law, it's a challenge. So I don't know what's going to happen with the bill. Sort of suspect since it got pulled that there's going to be some amendments, or this will be gutted and amended to run another proposal.
Can we just not do anything, perhaps?
Yeah, we can do nothing. We can wait and see what happens.
I mean, I'd like to hear what other people think. There's
Yes.
other licensees out here.
Yep. Any public comments in that sense?
Kenneth Edwards, California Association for LPCC. I echo the same comment as I remember being a licensee moving from out of state, and my address of record is my house at that point. And when I realized that, you kind of get a little nervous because we deal with a lot of clients with a range of presenting issues. And we've heard the same feedback from some members as well, that it's just a little weird to have your home address on a very public website. Yeah.
Janley Wong, NASW. This is a pretty old issue. It's been around for decades regarding home addresses. There's a couple of things that have come up over the years. One of them is for people who practice in their own home, there's a number of licensees that practice in their own home. They have to get some sort of alternate address, which they do, P.O. Box. There is a cost to a P.O. Box, as you all know. It's not exorbitant, but it's a cost. It could be almost $200 a year. So that's a concern for those who practice at home and don't have any other address except to get a P.O. Box. The other consideration, which complicates matters, doesn't necessarily address this issue in particular, but there are confidential addresses for law enforcement and for child welfare workers. So a number of licensees of this board and registrants are child welfare workers. So they probably have that avenue as far as confidential address, probably through the DMV, but not so much through this board. So those are the two other complicating considerations.
Maya Nahar with Kemp. Just a quick question. I know it was mentioned earlier that they're not necessarily required to provide their home address, but are they somehow informed that they don't actually have to provide their home address and they have the option to provide an alternative address?
Yeah, all of our applications say address of public record with a little asterisk, and then at the bottom it says you can provide a work address or a PO box, and that's where all of your mail will go to.
And it also informs the registrants and licensees that whatever address is actually put on the application will be public record. So
Yes.
that's clear.
Yeah. So the thing is, we do have options provided for the, for the registrants, to provide whatever the address, that it doesn't necessarily, have to be a home, but also a consideration of PO box and, and a business address. So the thing is, it does have options,
There are
if there are
options.
another, avenues. So, so any other discussion from the board? Are we ready to make a motion? Where are we feeling? Feeling like you don't want to take action, or straight up oppose it, or?
I think we could probably just watch it, the bill.
We could, in
see-
May, we'll know more how it's looking.
Yes,
Yeah,
we'll know where it is in May.
if things are gonna change, looks like, it's changing like the weather.
Right.
Okay, so if we take no action, then we
We
can
can move-
actually move on.
Move on.
Yeah, so I forgot to mention that, the next agenda item, actually, agenda item number 4, we're gonna not discuss it. And also agenda number 7, we're not gonna discuss that also. And also 16, the discussion and possible recommendation regarding other legislation affecting the board. Those, all 3, we will take it out of the agenda.
Right.
Yes.
Item 4, we will probably more than likely see in May, but we're working
But
with the
not
author
today.
on some technical amendments. And the other one, 7, looked like it was going to affect us, but it doesn't now.
Okay. So we will see more for those 2 bills probably in the May meeting.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but for now, we can skip it. So let's move on to item number 5, and that is the BBS registrants and licenses. So
Yeah.
Roseanne?
AB 613.
Oh, sorry, it's my bad. It's, I skipped it. So AB 613, yes.
Yes,
And it's
yes.
about the regulatory fees.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so this bill would allow a board under DCA to increase any of its authorized fees once every 4 years by an amount up to the consumer price index for the preceding 4 years. The consumer price index is typically calculated, it's a percentage change in the cost of living. This particular, there's several different types of CPIs. The particular CPI that this bill is referring to is the California Consumer Price Index from April 1st to April 1st. So they've specified very specific criteria. And it's calculated by the California Department of Industrial Relations. Our licensing laws, of course, they set maximum fees that we may charge in statute, and then we follow that up with regulations to specify the fees the board is actually currently charging. So in this case, if the board wanted, under this bill, if they wanted to increase the fees by the CPI, they would provide we would provide the calculations to the director of the department, and then the director would review it and would have to approve the fee increase unless they could claim that there are certain concerning circumstances, such as the fee increase would be injurious to the public health and safety. It's not a reasonable fee increase, things like that. The fee increase would not be subject to the typical regulation or statutory process. So we could do it once every 4 years by that amount. The author notes that because the legislative and regulatory process is so burdensome or cumbersome, boards tend to delay raising fees until they absolutely have to, and then the fee increases that result from that are pretty large and they're often controversial. So the argument here is that using the CPI would allow the fee increases to be more modest over time. Currently, to go through the legislative or regulatory process, it can take about 1 to 2 years in order to do that. So there is a lengthy waiting period. There's a calculator for the CPI on the Department of Industrial Relations website. Just sort of for fun, I went and plugged in the last 8 years. From April 2010 to 2014, it would have been an 8.3% increase. And from April 14 to April 2018, it would have been a 10.3% increase. That would be the maximum that we could have increased. We wouldn't have to increase it by that amount. Typically, our fees range from around $75 to $200, depending on what the fee is for. The board is currently undergoing a fee audit and is looking at its first fee increase since the mid-1990s. We expect to present the results of the fee audit, I believe, this spring. And also, we are expecting that we'll probably have to pursue legislation and regulations to raise fees within the next year. It's unlikely that this bill would allow the board to avoid that this time, but in the future, it could help our fees keep pace with inflation a little bit better. There's starting to be some support and opposition for this bill. The currently enlisted as support is now the California Board of Accountancy and the California Pharmacists Association. And the California Orthopedic Association is registered in opposition, citing that licensing fees for doctors are already very high, and it could discourage doctors from coming to the state. So those are some of the arguments that are out there right now. So we can open it up for discussion.
Board member, any discussion? So, I'm curious, now for the existing method of doing fee audits, from the initiation of the fee audit to possibly, pursuing legislation, how long the whole process is going to be?
Could be 1 to 2 years or longer, depending. You do a so we started the fee audit for our particular experience. We started the fee audit in the summer. It concluded in February, so roughly 6-7 months. And then we'll present it to the board in May for consideration. If you like what we present and approve it, then we would, depending on where that fee is specified in our laws, we would initiate the process. If it's a rulemaking change, we would start that. And under the current structure, we're looking at 1.5 to 2 years for rulemaking. Alternatively, if it's in the legislative process, we could not introduce it until next legislative season, which would be January 2020.
So it will take a long.
So it's going to take a little bit of time. Right. But even as Roseanne pointed out, I mean, the increases that if this was in effect now, it's based on our early information. This would, even if you took the largest 10% increase, it would not be enough to sustain our operating expenses because we have not had an increase since the mid-90s. So, but I like the option that's being presented here because if after we do the increase, we're 8 years down the road and we're starting to see a little dip, then we can consider using this option and seek whatever the index is at that point in time. And it would be a smaller increase as opposed to it's now 20 years later and let's really, it's going to be a larger increase than most people would like to see.
And I think that's exactly, what I'm bringing up the concern. One is, the length of time that possibly can catch up with, already, the increase. And so, and it also, the current practice is pretty costly.
It is, but I would say that our current fees are probably less than they are across the country.
Talk about the audit,
the
audit?
The
fee audit.
The fee audit, yeah, the fee audit
cost something, yeah.
Well, the fee audit, yeah, there was an expense to that. But, there's other factors. It's quite possible that we could get very fortunate and in our sunset bill next year, we could include this legislative piece to raise our fees. and that would make it sooner rather than later. But I don't know. It depends. But in order for us to even get to this point to consider increasing our fees, our loans had to be paid back, which this year they will be, and we have to demonstrate, some inequity in our funds. So, and we're going to be able to do that.
Betty?
I just had the comment that while the the opposition is well taken in terms of certain fees and certain professions, it doesn't say that we have to raise the fees. It says that we can.
Right, it's
So as
permissive.
long as it's permissive,
Mhm.
I don't know, I think there's certainly a way around those concerns that other entities have expressed about other boards. Not specifically our board, but I know it's a packet, so.
I would agree. And Assemblymember Lowe is chair of the Assembly Business and Professions Committee, and he is well aware of some of the concerns that many of the boards and bureaus have about our current regulatory process. Most board and bureau fees reside in the regulations, and so this is what I would call Plan B if you need something rather quickly.
All right, so I guess one thought I have as a licensee, I know that it's important for licensees to bear their share of the responsibility to ensure that the BBS is functioning and operational. But I guess one thought is, how could we as a board create some sort of criteria that we utilize, a grid to determine when we will actually raise fees, so that, because the potential that exists here is that we could raise the fees every 4 years, and then at a certain point, it could potentially become cost prohibitive for people to actually continue to maintain their license. A lot of our licensees work in nonprofits because they love the values, and those jobs don't particularly pay as well as some of the other positions. And so we want to be sensitive to people who aren't making an excessive amount of money. So,
I would agree.
so while I suggest, I guess while I like it, I think as a board, we would need to create, like I said, clear criteria about when we would consider raising fees, and then sort of move from there.
Okay. Okay.
The bill actually has a clause in it that the director can deny the fee increase if the board has unencumbered funds that exceed, that are more than the board's operating budget for the next 2 years. So that's kind of when it starts getting close. So if we had more than that, then the director could reject it.
Right, and you often hear that kind of description from your budget analyst when they come to the meetings, and they'll tell you what months you have in reserve, and they'll tell you, and they'll tell your EO when you're close or if things are getting kind of tight, where they're going to recommend a fee increase. So that will all play into this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as board members, when we, have our business part of the board meeting, we do have the financial, the kind of the budget report, to see, the months in reserve. And so I think, there's the practice that, if the projection, after certain years that, that our reserve is going to start to dip, because it's always that indicator, right? How many months, whether our fund condition is healthy. So I think, those will be a really good indicator, to see if we need to increase our fee, in order to, guarantee that the operation is smooth, it's not being interrupted because of no money. So I like the idea of the bill. I really do, because I think, when I talk to my my interns, about like there's going to be possibly fee increase, and go, ooh, but I told them last time we increased, it's like 20 something years ago. And so they understand, they understand. So, but I think it's more like having, I think it's twofold. To me, it's like, with a mechanism that is a little bit easier, a little less cumbersome. I think that is really, really good. And the other thing is also, kind of giving people that, that possibility that, that maybe every, periodically, this is becoming a little bit more predictable if it's necessary. And, and it doesn't cost so much, for the board to, to spend money on doing all these things. I mean, think about the labor power, it's a lot. Yeah. So I like the bill, but I don't know if there's going to be, any changes or any other minor adjustment. So I don't. I like the bill. So I would love to hear the public. Any comments? You're up, Janley.
Janley Wong, NASW. I think it's really important that there be a relatively smooth process in terms of making sure that your revenue meets your expenses. That's obvious. The concern, and I'm not saying the current process is that great, but the concern would be transparency.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't see, it might be in there, but I didn't see any provision regarding either public hearings or an opportunity for licensees and registrants to come forward and express whatever opinion they have about a fee increase. I think that's important. When it goes through the legislature, as you all know, very few people comment, but there is the opportunity for people to go to the legislature, to hearings and comment about fee increases. So I think that's kind of the important thing as this bill goes along. If the board and perhaps the author think about finding some way to make it clear there's a mechanism for registrants and licensees to participate in the discussion.
Well, given the makeup and the structure of our board, the bill in here doesn't say I can go make that request or any executive officer. It says, the board. So before we did anything, I would have to have your approval. So that would we would do it at a public meeting. I wouldn't want to do it in secret anyway, only because it looks like we're trying to, it's just shady. It's just not, it's not the right thing to do.
The transparency, like Jenny said, is actually very important, because it is an accountability issue too. How we can, make sure that, the public know about, the direction where we're going. So, great. Any other comments? No? Okay. So it looks like, yeah.
So I move to support the bill.
Okay. I'll second that. Anybody want a second? Okay, I'll second that. Any other discussion about the motion? Yeah. Okay, awesome. So we're ready.
Okay. Christina Wong?
Yes.
Betty Conley?
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox?
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So let's, the next agenda item is the federally qualified health centers and rural health clinics and the licensed LPCC.
Yes, so this is AB 769. It's sponsored by the California Association for Licensed Professional Clinical Counselors, CalPIC, and it would allow Medi-Cal reimbursement for covered mental health services provided by a licensed professional clinical counselor who is employed by either a federally qualified health center, referred to as an FQHC, or a rural health clinic, referred to as an RHC. So currently, we have these two types of health centers, and they provide covered Medi-Cal benefits that are reimbursed on a per-visit basis. A FQHC or an RHC visit is defined as a face-to-face encounter between a patient and one of several types of professionals. It can be a physician, it can be a clinical psychologist, it can be a clinical social worker, or marriage and family therapist. However, LPCCs, being the board's newest license type, are not included in that list, which means that there's sort of a hiring disincentive for these centers to hire LPCCs. So this bill would add LPCCs to the list of professionals that can be seen. Currently, there's about 600 FQHCs and 350 RHCs across California. And LMFTs were the most recent professionals to be added to this list back in 2016. The sponsor states that adding LPCCs to the list will help rural areas also meet the increase in demand for mental health services because there will be more providers. This bill ran in 2017 as AB 1591. The board had a support position on the bill. However, the bill was vetoed by the governor. At the time, the Department of Healthcare Services was developing a new payment model for health clinics, and it was supposed to eliminate the need to add specific providers to a list. And so he said at the time the bill was unnecessary. The sponsor notes that the payment model that the governor was working towards was not approved. And so in 2018, that project was terminated. So the need is still there to have the list of providers. So that has not been eliminated. So that's why we see this bill again today.
So,
No,
Go
I was just going
ahead.
to say, I think it's important for us on a number of levels to really support this. One, with the workforce shortages here in California, looking at ensuring that the clients that come to care actually have access to providers, no matter where they live. That's important. I think, too, we as a state have embraced the LPCC license, so we need to provide opportunities for them to be employed and to sort of contribute to the amelioration of mental health needs that exist in our state. And then just three, as an MFT, I know what it's like to be marginalized and treated unfairly. So I think it's important for LPCCs to bring parity to sort of the workforce here. And so I think it's important to support it on those three levels.
Yeah, Betty?
I'm 100% in support. I mean, we supported it 2 years, whatever, a year ago, 2 years ago. I don't know why it didn't get included in the previous iterations of the revisions, but it's long overdue.
Yes, and honestly, if we supported it before, there's really no reason, why we would change our position, because of, the possible marginalization, right, Jonathan? I like that word. Any public comments?
Kenneth Edwards, California Association for LPCC. Thank you all for your previous consideration and current consideration of this bill. It's really going to open up the hireability, the ability to bill and see our clients and really help those populations that we need to serve that really need this care. As you all are well aware, we're still having an issue with DHCS that we're on the eve of a fix. So we're really excited about that, and this will really help to really, like we talked about earlier, drive home the point that, LPCCs are here. We do great work, and our clients need us, and thank you. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Maya Nahar with Kemp. Just want to voice that we have taken a separate position on the bill.
Great. All right. Any other public comments? Okay, so looks like we are ready for a motion.
I'll,
Not yet. I think we are, right?
You done?
okay.
Yeah.
Go first.
I'll move that.
I want to make sure we're clear on our recommendations today, that we're recommending to the full board to take a position on the
Oh,
board.
yes, yes.
And I know we missed it in the first one.
I move that the committee recommend to the board to support this bill.
I second that.
Okay. Any other discussion about the recommendation of the motion? Motion recommendation. To the support position. Okay. All right, we're ready to vote.
Christina Wong,
Yes.
Betty Conley,
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whittlesbach.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So let's move on to the next one, and that's AB 1145 about reportable conduct, child abuse.
Yes, so AB 1145 is being authored by Assemblymember Garcia. She authored this bill a couple of years ago as well. And this bill would specify that voluntary acts of sodomy, oral copulation, and sexual penetration are not considered acts of sexual assault that must be reported by a mandated reporter as child abuse if there are no indicators of abuse, unless it is between a person of age 21 or older and a minor under age 16. Under existing law, it establishes the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, also known as CANRA, and it requires a mandated reporter to make a report in instances where the reporter knows or reasonably suspects that a child has been a victim of child abuse or neglect. CANRA defines sexual abuse for purposes of reporting requirements as sexual assault or exploitation. And then it goes on to further define sexual assault as consisting of any of the following certain acts: rape, statutory rape, rape in concert, incest, sodomy, oral copulation, lewd or lascivious acts upon a child, sexual penetration, or child molestation. And so the author's attempt here is to clarify a longstanding source of confusion in the law. We've had this discussion a few times over the years. um, the concern is that the requirements for mandated reporters of child abuse are confusing, inconsistent, and discriminatory. Some mandated reporters interpret the law to read that consensual sodomy and oral copulation is illegal with anyone under age 18, and it always requires a mandated report as sexual assault under CANRA. This interpretation, they argue that the same reporting standards do not apply to consensual heterosexual intercourse. There are also contradictory opinions that the law does not read this way, and that sodomy and oral copulation are not treated differently from other acts in the code. However, the answer is not clear, and so it leads to confusion about whether it's reportable or not. And the law really reads, it's very complicated. There's a lot of different layers to it. It's very confusing to read when you look at this law. So the author is seeking to make the law more consistent. The board examined this issue in 2013 when stakeholders expressed concern. However, staffers at the legislature also reached out to the board at that time, stating that there has been past legal opinions and that this interpretation of CANRA was incorrect. So overall, the board was concerned at that time about a potential legal misinterpretation of CANRA, and it asked staff to obtain a legal opinion from the DCA legal office. So we have that 2013 opinion in the packet today. It's attachment A. And DCA found that CANRA does not require a mandated reporter to report such incidents unless there is reasonable suspicion of force, exploitation, or other abuse. And DCA cited some case law that was based on some court rulings to go into this opinion. In response to this, the Board of Psychology then sought an opinion from the Attorney General's office in conjunction with the author of this bill. The Board of Psychology asked the AG to resolve several legal questions related to this. The request was turned in by Assemblywoman Garcia in February 2015. However, there's a related case currently under review by the California Supreme Court, and the AG's office has suspended the opinion until after that's ruled on. And so there's no estimated timeline of when that might occur. And so this is where we are with that today. Assemblywoman Garcia ran a similar bill in 2014. The Policy and Advocacy Committee had recommended a support position on the bill. However, it died before the board was able to take a position on it. And then AB 832 was run by her again in 2015, very similar. The board took a support if amended position on that bill at that time and asked for an amendment clarifying that only non-abusive sexual conduct would not be reportable. The author did make that amendment per the board's request, and it is included in today's wording of the bill as well. However, AB 832 died on the assembly floor. Basically, with this, there's a lot of confusion about how the law actually reads, and so it has a tendency to get controversial when it goes to the legislature because there's just so much confusion surrounding it. At this time, there's been some recent support that's come out right now. As of this week, the California Psychological Association has come out in support, also the California Public Defenders Association. And there's still no known opposition at this time.
Board members, we kind of we talked about this so much. So, and we supported it, and I recall the discussions that, it's so clear as mud, so, but at the same time, this is, the bill would actually, at least to really clarify that, about, the voluntary act, and then the non-abusive nature, that is not reportable. So one little, clarification, which is good. Jonathan, you have I'm just reading your body language. You have feedback?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Any other? Go ahead.
No, I mean, it makes sense. I think as a practitioner, we were always trained that the intent of the law around sexual behavior with minors was to ensure that anything that occurred was consensual or experimental between two similarly developmentally aged minors, that there are two people who are similarly aged, so that no one is actually being exploited. I guess the thing that just, so I support it. I mean, I guess I'm supportive of it because what we're really trying to do is ensure that kids are not exploited through any sexual behavior. And I think it's we need to roll these other behaviors into sort of the fold so that we can protect kids and have a process to prosecute those who may fall outside of the things that I shared earlier. So that's my thought.
Yeah, Betty, go ahead.
So when I've done training in reporting, mandated reporter training, I've always referred to the document, the Kathy Atkins document. That's been like our go-to kind of point of reference. So it seems to me that the new legislation is just restating the Kathy Atkins document. Am I reading that correctly?
Basically, it's making it more clear in
Making
code.
it more clear, but it's not changing. I mean, it looks like it's pretty close to the Kathy Atkins document, or
It's pretty close. There's a lot of different interpretations because this applies to mandated reporters in general, all mandated reporters. So not everybody's going to be referring to that document. There's just a lot of confusion about reading the law at face value, what it actually says.
Right.
And so that's what it's trying to fix.
okay.
You know, I think we talked about, you know, previous meetings that the reasonable suspicion is always, you know, of having of the child abuse is always a very, very gray area, you know, because that, you know, defaults on the practitioner, you know, to see if that particular act, you know, is deemed to be reportable. So this actually gives a little indicator that, you know, if this is consensual, fall within, you know, the age group that is not reportable, then it's not reportable. So it's almost like it's, you know, helping the, you know, clarify, you know, what is reportable and what is not, and also give a good guidance, you know, for the practitioners so that they're not, you know, reporting everything that might possibly be, you know, not within that scope, or there's no abuse element. So.
And I just think, and I would add too to that, I think in practice, what a lot of practitioners do is they will call their local Child Protective Service office and consult. This is what's going on. What do you think? So practitioners don't have to function in isolation when things like this come up. They consult with their CPS agency, and then a determination can be made at that point. So.
No. So I would love to open it for public comments, and, you know, especially Mr. Jerry Grossman, you know, you deal with, you know, the training a lot, and so we'd love to hear your feedback.
Well, thank you. Well, in teaching law classes throughout the state, this is always a very contentious discussion. And so most people are not following the law, which is Penal Code 11165.1. Or people will say, well, in my informed consent, I just have a don't ask, don't tell policy. So I don't think that's a really good position for a therapist to be taking when somebody is dealing with their emerging sexuality and therapists are saying, oh, please don't talk about that. That's not what therapy is all about. There are people who are, in fact, reporting consensual oral or anal sex. And that, of course, plays with the therapeutic relationship and can really damage or end the therapeutic relationship because somebody is actually following the law. So this is an issue, as you've stated, that has been going around for a long time. In fact, since 2009, there have been stakeholders involved in trying to change the law. In my opinion, what Assembly Person Garcia is trying to do is just to clarify things. So there's not this sense of confusion about it. And also, people who are not reporting place themselves in jeopardy. And that is that wonder if a parent is litigious, finds out that their child told the therapist about their consensual sexual activity. The child has now developed an STD, and the therapist is now being sued because they didn't follow the law. So I think that for all these reasons, it makes sense to have this thing cross the finish line, and appreciate your support with this bill.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the information. That's, really represent, in the public, in the registrants, the kind of the confusion, and possibly, kind of like the legal responsibility, to, and their struggle, to whether to report or not report. Any other public comments? Jenny?
Janley Wong, NASW, again, another historic issue here. I think the issue does need to be clarified, and this is like the first attempt to do so. I'm concerned, and it doesn't necessarily have to be attached to this bill, even though when you have a bill going, you can attach all kinds of things. We're in a high technology social media age, and the issue of people filming their activities, minors filming their activities, even if it's consensual and voluntary, uploading it is a really big concern. And we don't want this bill, I don't think it does, but I'm not sure, would say that kind of activity is okay, because actually it's not okay. And I don't know the court case that's before the Supreme Court, but we might want to consider, the board might want to consider taking a look at it in that context. Of course, we don't know when they'll finish taking a look at it, but this idea that once you say certain types of activities are okay, and when you have minors involved and they have no judgment and they do all kinds of things, and then they start using social media, we could really see some unintended consequences. So it's just sort of something we need to think about when we're talking about public policy.
So I want to say thank you because I actually was, that's the first thing that came into my mind. And it was really based on the fact that we updated recently the Therapy Does Not Include Sexual Behavior brochure. With the advent of technology, with the child sexual exploitation problem that's going on, where people are providing minors cell phones so that they can do sexual chatting, or if a minor is exploited by an adult to do things over the phone. I mean, I think the language in here needs to include sort of just the technological reality that exists to just sort of open this up beyond just in-person behaviors, because there are ways to exploit children that are not, where you don't have to be in person, but it's still equally problematic and equally damaging. So if there's a way to sort of include sort of some of that reality, that would be very helpful. So thank you for bringing that up.
So, so what I read is like, even though it's specified, the certain acts, but still there's a clause that if there are no indicator of abuse. So, I think that is a very important thing. It's like, yes, those acts are, permissible or clarify, those acts. And yet, if there's still, the indicator of, any elements of abuse, I think that is a very important thing for practitioner to remember, then there's a suspicious, a reasonable suspicion, of abuse, and that becomes reportable. So that's just, so in terms of that sexting and, posting the video and stuff like that, and that becomes, if it's become a coercion, for the victim or for the children. And I think that constitutes a little bit more complicated issue. It's not as straightforward. Yeah. Christine.
I think those problems are important. But I'd hate to see, we have been trying for so long to get some clarification on this language. I'd hate to see the bill not go forward if the author wasn't willing to include some of that language, which I do think is important. Is there any way that we could just have a conversation with maybe the author's office instead of like saying support unless they put this language in or something like that?
Yeah, we can mention that to them.
Because
technical support is what we could call it.
Technical, because I think that we should still recommend supporting this language even if we couldn't get some of those other very important things in.
Right, and you can, Roseanne, I'm sure could reach out to the author's office and have an update maybe by your May meeting, and maybe,
Definitely.
you know, maybe she could work with them on incorporating some possible language or ideas.
Yeah, we can do that.
I think we can, maybe the motion would be, we support it and, then direct staff to continue to provide technical support. So maybe that would, yeah, that would be our recommendation.
And who knows what form it might be in by the time we see everybody again in May.
Yeah.
Right. I would reach out and have a conversation, and kind of gauge their degree of willingness. It's possible that they might be willing. It's possible they might say, well, this is a big enough issue, to tackle, needs to be done in another bill. I'm not sure what they would say, but we can definitely have the conversation.
Okay.
So
we're saying what now? We're saying we
We
support
support.
it, but we see we have some thoughts about how to make it much more relevant to sort of the reality where we live, and then there'll be a conversation, it sounds like.
Yeah.
between
Well,
them.
and I think that if you look at what the question posed by Assemblymember Garcia and the Board of Psychology, I mean, they do talk about the sexting activity between minors of like age. So I would say that that concern is on her mind. She's thinking about it, and I'm sure that if it was expanded to, what you described, Jonathan, is the abuse or exploitation of a minor, I mean, I think it would be reasonable to present our concern or just our thoughts to the author's office.
My best guess is that this has been a really complicated bill for a really long time. And so my guess is that they would probably choose to tackle that separately. I'm just speaking because adding one more thing to this, they've just had such a hard time getting it through because of the confusion surrounding it, that they're probably going to be more willing to do that separately. Yeah.
But it doesn't stop us to have that technical support.
We can definitely, bring it up that we'd be supportive of that and we'd like to see it.
Betty?
Well, I just want to second what Christine said, that this has been a pending issue. It's a huge issue. We need to get it moved through, and while if they're open to talking about it, that's fine, but I wouldn't like to derail the process in any way. So I just wanted to make really clear that I think we should recommend that the board consider supporting it.
Support, and Roseanne will continue to talk with the author's office about those concerns, which were already brought up by psychology, and then we'll see it again in May.
Right. And Mr. Grossman?
In terms of the technological part of this, in 2015, AB 1175 dealt with issues about downloading and sexting, et cetera. So I would think that concern has already been addressed in the law.
Are you ready for a motion?
Okay. Awesome. Good information. So looks like we're ready for a motion. So
Move to recommend the board support this with the idea that we'll be providing technical support to the author's office.
I'll second that. Okay. So any other discussion about the motion? Okay. We're ready.
Who's second?
Me.
Thank you. Christina Wong,
Yes.
Betty Conley,
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitliswatt.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Let's see. Do we need to take a break or are we still good moving on? Okay, let's continue. So the next one is about music therapy, AB 1651.
AB 1540.
Oh, sorry. AB 1540, sorry about that.
So yes, this is another bill that we saw a few years back. It seeks to define music therapy in statute and to provide guidance to consumers regarding education and training requirements for qualified music therapists. Several state agencies currently define music therapy in their regulations, and there's varying definitions. Some of them are a little bit obsolete. So, the most recent definition was from the California Department of Education. It uses the Certification Board for Music Therapists definition and recognizes their credential. There's also health facilities that defines it. The Department of Mental Health has a definition. Public health has a definition. There's some references in these various definitions to obsolete agencies and things that no longer exist. So this bill is attempting to kind of put a standard definition into place, so there's not all this conflict. It establishes the Music Therapy Act. It provides a definition of music therapy. It defines music therapy interventions. It prohibits referring to yourself as a board-certified music therapist unless you've completed certain educational requirements. You have to have at least a bachelor's degree or higher from a program approved by the American Music Therapy Association, or AMTA. At least 1,200 hours of supervised clinical work, and completing certification requirements established by the Certification Board for Music Therapists. And then it also does specifically state that the law does not authorize someone engaging in music therapy to state that they provide mental health counseling or psychotherapy. And it also implies that the use of music does not imply or suggest that the person is a board-certified music therapist. So there's two organizations that are jointly currently involved in the certification process for music therapists. We have the American Music Therapy Association, which handles sort of the education side, and then the Certification Board for Music Therapists, which has a board exam and then issues the certification, has a renewal process, and continuing education process and disciplinary process for its people that have its certification. And they've jointly developed this definition of the scope of therapy of practice, and that's shown in attachment A. The bill contains language stating that the use of music therapy is not restricted to any profession, so our licensees that are using music therapy can continue to do so as long as they don't state that they're a certified music therapist, unless, of course, they actually are. It also protects the board's practice acts by saying that somebody cannot state that they practice mental health counseling or psychotherapy if they're not licensed. So everything seems good there. The board was neutral on this bill when it ran in 2015. The bill was vetoed by Governor Jerry Brown. He was reluctant to add another license or title statutes. He had a cute veto message, which I've included for your enjoyment in the package. So we can open it up for discussion.
I like your sense of humor. Why have the state now add another violin to the orchestra? So, I know. So Christine and then Jonathan.
I just have a question for Roseanne. So I was a little confused. It looks like this doesn't create a new license. It looks more like a title protection law or trademark law. Is that what?
Exactly.
Okay, I just wanted clarification. Okay.
So I have some, I guess, concerns about the language. A lot of the language in here sounds, for a lay person, a client, it makes it very, in my mind, makes it very difficult for them to discriminate between someone who is a mental health practitioner and someone who is not. I mean, the terms clinical, evidence-based practices, the word therapist in the language, it seems like it has the potential for a client to maybe seek out a service that is not necessarily in their best interest. So I guess I have a couple of questions. How would the industry sort of ensure that clients who have mental health disabilities seek out services with an actual mental health provider versus going to a music therapist? I guess that's one question I have that I don't really know an answer to. What type of client is a good candidate for music therapy? I mean, to be honest, I've been in the field 25 years and I've never heard of a music therapist, and I don't know anyone that's actually practiced it. And it's no indictment against the industry. I just don't know anyone. Typically, when people have adjunct skills like art therapy or things, they are a master's or doctoral level licensed therapist, and they have an ATR to be an art therapist. So I'm concerned that someone may put themselves out there as a music therapist without having sort of the foundational clinical training around understanding, hey, if your client becomes suicidal while you're playing music, what do you do? And I'm not being funny. I'm just saying that is the potential here. So there's just a lot of questions about it.
And you also have to think about the client's remedies too.
Right. Right. I mean, because it talks about doing an assessment, it talks about having a treatment plan, it talks about working on, there's just a lot of things that just are very concerning to me when we talk about vulnerable populations seeking out services to address mental health concerns.
There's just enforcement too.
there's a great potential for consumer harm, and so that's ringing strong in my ear.
Christy?
And I'm not sure, are music therapists are already out there practicing, right? So this would just add some, so the concern is adding something to the law might give the wrong impression. Is that what you're saying, Jonathan? Okay.
So.
At least the language that's utilized here, yes, I think creates more ambiguity.
Yeah, the scope of practice that already exists, it's kind of putting in statute, recognizing in statute a scope of practice that these two agencies have put together that it talks about evidence-based practice, client-centered care, things like that. So it already exists, but it's codifying it basically.
Betty?
So I do, anybody who works in schools has a fairly extensive experience dealing with the profession of music therapists. And while they do certainly have a role in certain places, to some extent they already exist and are already in different parts of the law in different iterations. But I guess my concern is that there already is a certification that is granted by the Music Therapists Association or whatever, and they have their own criteria for whatever, pros and cons that may be. It exists. I mean, we can't change that. My concern is that by having actual legislation that clarifies the certification, that in some way it adds another layer of legitimacy or another layer of implied capability of practice that I think could be misunderstood. It's already, I think, challenging for people to figure out an appropriate role and context for music therapy. And my only concern would be that by adding this type of legislation, we're kind of almost blessing the profession and in all its possible applications. And I just would have some concerns about that.
Christine, go ahead.
So I guess I don't have those concerns. I think all this language does is they don't want people who are not certified music therapists to call themselves music therapists. I mean, to me, that's all this does. I don't want to make any judgments about music therapists. I don't feel like I know enough about music therapy, even though I know several music therapists, to make that judgment. But I don't feel like it sends the wrong message. I just wanted to put that out there.
I'm wondering, so do we know to what extent the fraudulent use of the term music therapist is happening in the state? Like, are there a significant number of people who are saying I'm a music therapist when in actuality they aren't? I mean, what is the
Roseanne, did the author provide that? Or?
They didn't provide that information. They just said that the definitions are inconsistent and they want kind of a uniform practice. So they didn't go into they probably don't really have a mechanism for knowing because there's no violation of law.
Right, who would report it?
Right, there's nothing to report to. They wouldn't report it to us. They could report it to the certification board, but they can't really do anything. So that's why I think you're seeing it saying it's an unfair practice to use the title because they're trying to put something in law so that they can do something.
And I guess a follow-up question is, do we know at this point, just in terms of their industry, can they actually rent a space, put out a shingle and say, I'm John Doe, music therapist, and have an independent office? And
yes.
Okay, can I just say something? I mean, it is what it is, though. It's music therapy. I mean, I don't know necessarily that this board wants to make a judgment about music therapy. I mean, it's not LMFT. It's not LPCC. It's not that type of service. It's a different service. All these people are saying is, I don't want you, if you're not a certified music therapist, to call yourself a music therapist. I would imagine, to respond to where this might be happening, it's probably more prevalent with, I'm just guessing, it's a guess, with occupational therapists calling themselves music therapists, or I'm doing music therapy when they're not really doing it. It's probably not mental, like your guys' mental health sort of therapy people calling themselves music. I mean, I've never seen that.
What is the
I'm done.
I'm sorry. What is the recourse for a consumer, just out of curiosity, who may go to a music therapist and actually be harmed? Like, what is their recourse? Who do they call? What do they do? And I guess,
It doesn't, well, it'd be up to the
right, because
board.
we wouldn't do anything with it.
Right, right. The remedy is with the certifying agency if they have any type of enforcement procedure set up, which we
Do we know?
don't do it.
They have, they said that there's a disciplinary procedure, but that would be more, you would get your certification revoked maybe. But that still doesn't stop you from practicing. You just can't say that you're certified. It's not a license type like we have license types. So really, I mean, I would guess that if somebody had a major problem, they would have to sue it and take it through the courts that way. There's no body that.
Unless they're, cross licensed somewhere else, at
Right.
another one of our boards.
So I guess with that, I guess to me, there's enough ambiguity in this language in this bill that there's strong potential for a client to be misled, not intentionally by anyone, but it just happened. You say you're a therapist, I'm going here, I'm looking for something I don't get, and then someone is harmed. And then with that, there being no really real concrete recourse for a client, that this is pretty concerning, at least to me.
Would say, I didn't read any mechanism by which a consumer could place a complaint to Roseanne in the law.
There's the certificate. It's a certification process. So
Okay.
it's basically saying you can't say that you're a certified music therapist unless you are. And then through the certification process, they have ethics and they have, education that they have to take. But it's really saying the kind of regulatory mechanism is basically saying it's an unfair business practice if they're saying they're a music therapist and they're not. So basically you're requiring them, if they're saying they're a certified music therapist and they're not, then they can pursue legal action. And then if they're a certified music therapist, then there is a disciplinary process for those people in there.
Okay.
So they could pursue it with that entity. And that's the same. I mean, there's dance therapy certification and
Right.
play therapy certification and things like that, art therapy. So there are these boards that are out there. This would just say basically you can't use their title
Unless you have that
unless you
certification.
have title protection.
And when I look at where they're going to include that in the Business and Professions Code, it's going to fall right underneath, it's going to be an additional chapter titled Music Therapy Act or Music Therapy, however they're going to do it. Very similar to how they added the Massage Therapy Act. It's going to be its entirely separate chapters. So, it may be, it's a first step in terms of making the certification a license. And then it
Maybe,
but
not
right
necessarily.
now it's only title protection, period.
I mean, in order to become a license, they would have to prove harm to public and all
Correct.
that. And I don't know that that's out there. To me, they're just trying to protect the title. I don't see it as an encroachment on anybody else's license or even really confusing. That's how I look at it. But
Right. Right.
obviously,
Kind of
not
in
anyone.
the same fashion that you can't call yourself a massage therapist unless A, B, and C. Whereas our acts are practice acts as well as, and that does include some title protection, but they go hand in hand.
So it does. So it's a title protection bill. That's what I But at the same time, they say that who is going to certify it. I mean,
Yes.
I don't. Yeah.
It's the Certification Board for Music Therapists, the CBMT. So there's two entities. The American Music Therapy Association accredits and certifies the school programs, makes sure that the students going through have a certain experience hours, and then the Certification Board, they do the exam, and then they certify you, and then you have to do some CE to
Yes.
maintain it, and you have a code of ethics you have to follow. And there's disciplinary.
So I
actions.
guess that my question is that, I know that they're certifying right now for that, national accreditation, body. But for the state to do this title protection, so under which department of the state that they're going to be, responsible for overviewing or, so where does it go?
It's not placed anywhere. I don't
So
see that it's placed under any department, so it's just.
It's just a
a
title
law that
protection.
says you
Yeah.
can't call yourself that if you're not that.
Right.
That's all. I mean, it's not a licensing board.
Right,
No,
I know,
it's-
but that's always the first step. You have the title protection.
But it doesn't
No, not
always
always.
go.
Not always, huh?
No, no, not always.
So, okay, I think we're also, have some interesting discussion. So I would like to open to the public, any feedback and discussion information for us to consider.
Janley Wong, NASW. As far as I can tell, this would create a sort of sole source provision for one organization in terms of certification and for another organization in terms of accrediting college and university programs. And I kind of understand that because people will say, well, that's the only one in the country, or that's the only one available. I think there is a problem there in that if Jerry, for example, thanks, Jerry, he wanted to create a music therapy certification program, he would not be recognized by this statute or this legislation. So that's a concern of mine. When you create public policy and legislation, just say, this one organization is it.
Gary Grossman. I have more of a question than a response, and that is with art therapists. I know that art therapists would say, well, you can't call yourself an art therapist unless you've had specified training. So I see this as being analogous to that. And I don't know where art therapists are in terms of statute. Well, it would be the same situation, right?
I don't think art therapy is recognized as or a certified art therapist. I don't see anything in the law for that.
No.
So this would be one of the first.
That's interesting because we've done workshops where the person who is an art therapist made a clear distinction saying you can't call yourself an art therapist unless you've had this designated training. So I think there is an organization for art therapists who are putting their blessing on somebody. So I just see it as being analogous.
There might be, but there's no law, I guess, in
Right.
California that says they can't. So
Right.
they can say that you can't call themselves that, but there's no law that says that.
Probably there's probably an organization that came up with their own title and they said, this is our title. If you have to go through our program to call yourself this. But another organization could come up and create their own title too and say, well, we're a competing art therapy program and here's our title. You have to go through our program to call yourself that.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Any other public comments? Okay, so I think we come back to, maybe, I've heard, different different feedbacks. So maybe I recommend maybe we just watch it and then see how it goes. I mean, that's the neutral position that we took before. And I mean, unless board members have burning,
Right.
I mean, to have a real strong desire, to have a position, otherwise I think, neutral probably is the most, non-controversial.
Right, and that's actually
Controversial.
taking a position of neutral instead of and just sitting back and watching like we did on the first one.
We can take a total neutral position
Or,
again.
yeah.
So what does that afford us moving forward? Are we saying neutral for a time period until we gather more information, or are we saying neutral, we will never have a
No.
opinion on this, and then this just sort of cruises through and is approved and
You can always have an opinion.
Yes.
until when?
You're going to see this again in May.
Okay.
Right.
The board has to take a decision.
Right.
Yes,
We're not
so
making
we're
it.
recommending
Right, yeah,
the
no,
board,
understand that
for a
part.
position.
Understand
Who knows what it might look like then, if it's even still there
Yes.
or,
Mhm.
right, and what the full board thinks.
So we can recommend a,
Okay, move
Yep.
that this committee recommend a neutral position to the board.
I'll second that. Okay, any other discussion about the motion? Okay, we're ready.
Christina Wong,
Yes.
Freddie Conley,
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox.
Oppose.
Thank you. Dr.
Opposed.
Christine Whitlisbach.
No.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So let's take a break. Now it's 10:20. Let's come back at 10:30. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Welcome back to the Board of Behavioral Sciences Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. The time is 10:33, and let's restart the meeting. And the next bill that we're going to talk is AB 1651. It's about licensed educational psychologists, the supervision of associates and trainees.
Yes, so this bill, AB 1651, is being authored by Assemblymember Medina, and its sponsor is the California Association of School Psychologists, or CASP. And it would allow applicants for licensure as a marriage and family therapist, professional clinical counselor, or clinical social worker to gain some supervised experience hours under a licensed educational psychologist. So currently, individuals that are seeking a license with this board as a marriage and family therapist, clinical counselor, or clinical social worker have to register as an associate with the board and gain 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised experience. We have various requirements set for supervisors. They have to be actively licensed in California, have to have held a license for a certain period of time, have to go through certain training, things like that. The law also requires supervisors who do not hold the same license as the associates intended field of licensure to have sufficient experience in that field. Individuals seeking licensure as an educational psychologist also have to meet certain education and experience requirements. They, for their particular license, have to obtain a master's degree in psychology, school psychology or equivalent, and then complete 60 semester hours of postgraduate work in pupil personnel services, 2 years full-time as a certified school psychologist or a credentialed school psychologist, and then an additional year of supervised experience and passage of the licensing exam. The law for a licensed educational psychologist also does include in their scope of practice that they may provide psychological counseling for individuals, groups, or families. So it does state that specifically. So this bill proposes allowing LEPs to be supervisors of our associate license types if they meet all of the board's other requirements to supervise. The hours would be limited under an LEP to no more than 1,200 hours. And then because the bill is proposing the LEPs be supervisors, which they are currently now not, it's adding several unprofessional conduct provisions into LEP statute related to supervision that the other three license types that our supervisors already have. So CASP, as I mentioned, is the sponsor of this bill. They note that there was a 2011 law change that shifted the responsibility to provide special education students mental health services from county mental health departments to the school districts. And the mental health services school districts provide to students with disabilities are called educationally related mental health services, or ERMs. CASP notes that many school districts are employing BBS associates to provide ERMs, and that the law requires ERMs service providers to be supervised by someone with a pupil personnel services credential. LEPs have a pupil personnel services credential and training in the education system, but they're not listed as supervisors, so it's not allowed. They point out that currently allowed supervisors of BBS associates do not typically have a PPS credential, and so that creates a problem where you have supervisors that have to be supervised by someone with a PPS credential as well. The bill would permit LEPs to supervise up to 1,200 hours. One point of possible discussion in previous discussions we've had the rationale for allowing LEPs to supervise as supervisors is that they have qualifications to supervise in ERM settings. However, the bill does not limit LEP supervisors as written to ERM settings. So the board or the committee may wish to discuss whether LEP supervision should be limited to ERM settings, and if there is a limit, how to identify in law, specify what an ERM setting is. In previous discussion, one of the committee meetings, there was a question of whether allowing LEPs to supervise associates would affect California licensees' ability to seek licensure in another state with portability question. We did at that time survey several states and present that information to the board. The concern seems to be satisfied. Some states would allow it, some states were not. I think that the kind of the discussion went to, well, you don't, it's sort of if you choose to get that, those specific hours might not count, but it's limited. And it looks like some states would accept it. If our portability bill were to go through and other states were to adopt that, it wouldn't be an issue if they were licensed in another state. So that's what I've got.
But that's by endorsement. If they have the
True.
license, then, then that's not an issue. But then, for some states like Florida, that if it's by examination, then those hours will be questionable.
True.
For
Several
some
states have
yeah.
two pathways, or some
Yes.
states just look at everything like we do right now.
Right.
That is out there.
Yes.
And the portability movement is going forward. I had a couple of conversations already this week and the past week about the portability issue, and there are a number of states watching our proposal. So if we go forward and that comes to fruition, that framework is likely to be adopted by other states.
Right.
So if you've been licensed 2 years, it won't matter.
Right.
So.
I think we pretty thoroughly, talked about, in the P&A that, the direction, it's certainly, it's worthwhile to go forward. My only question is about, I think Roseanne brought up a really good question. Is whether it should be limited just to, for the ERMS, setting. So, and my actually, I have a little consideration about the 1,200 hours too. And it is a pretty large amount of hours, because, especially for the LCSW internship track, right? Or the licensing track. So it's 2,000 hours maximum. 2,000 hours of the clinical hours, or above. And so if 1,200 hours, and that's already kind of like a little bit more than half. And so, so my consideration is that if some states really is not, accepting, the clinical hours, whether I'm not sure 1,200 hours, from my perspective, it's like, whether it would be, provide enough supervision, or the qualified supervision for, the license, to be able to get a good, comprehensive, training, about different, clinical setting other than just the education. So.
All this is saying is that they can be supervised up to 1,200 hours in a clinical setting. It's not eliminating the requirement for social workers that you still need 1,700 hours under a social worker. So that social worker, if they wanted to get 1,200 hours under an LEP, they're still going to have to get 1,700 hours under an LCSW. So that would be consideration for them to weigh. I can see, they could work in a school setting on a very limited basis, get those hours, and move to another setting where they would get the bulk of the hours under an LCSW. So I see this as an addition to, not a replacement of.
Yeah. So the other, sorry, let me finish that. So the MFT, allowable hours for the LCSW is 1,200 or 1,500?
In the MFT, they can be supervised under any one of the three license types. The only requirement for them is that of their clinical hours, 500 hours needs to be specific to marriage or to couples, families, and children. Right?
I think I confused you. So it's about, the LCS, the ASW clinical supervision hours, because I think for that 2,000 hours, I'm using MFT as an example. I think they can supervise up to, is it 1,200 or 1,500 hours? That's particular for ASW.
For ASWs, I don't think that there's a
There's no
limit.
limitation for MFTs. MFTs, for example, an MFT.
No, it's the MFT supervisor,
Right.
supervising an ASW. I
There's
think
no
there is a
limit.
limit.
No,
No,
there's no limit.
There's a limit by
Yeah.
default because.
Well, by default,
By
because
default,
1,700 hours
right,
have to be under an
so-
LCSW.
Yeah, the 17 under an LCSW, the remaining to get to 3,000 can be under any qualified supervisor.
So that would be, so in that sense, the ceiling would be actually 1,250. If it's 70, did you say
17, yeah,
seven, 1,750?
would be like 1,300 hours.
1,300
yeah,
hours.
for
Yeah.
everything, anybody else. So it
Right.
could be an MFT.
Could be an MFT, but that's a 1,300 hours. Okay.
Yeah.
So, so that's the, consistency that.
Well, I think, that's been in law for ASWs for as long as I've been sitting here, and much longer than that. And so I think what we see in the office is that we see the ASW applicants balance that where they can in their settings. They make sure that they cover the 1,700 required under an LCSW, and they may continue with that supervisor to continue to gain their other hours, or they'll use another supervisor. Here, I could see a scenario where an ASW could be 1,700 hours under their LCSW, and now they have the remaining hours to gain, and maybe they want a different experience. And they can seek out not only that experience under an MFT or an LPC, but also, if this were to become effective, an LEP in a school setting. And it would give them a more rounded experience. I don't think there's any harm or an unintended consequence by including the LEP as a supervisor for an ASW.
Roseanne?
One thing I'd also like to mention, we also have Chris Jones from CASP here to answer any questions, and we do have an attachment, a letter of support that I've handed out and placed in the back as well, for the record.
Jonathan?
So I guess I'd like to jump in because I didn't know that as a committee we were actually on the boat sailing towards sort of supporting this, because I think I've communicated from the outset that I have some outstanding concerns about LEP supervising any of the other licensees. I think for me, and while I have collaborated with LEPs when I was doing direct service in school districts, sat in IEP meetings, understand their critical role in sort of the amelioration of challenges that impact academic progress in children in our schools. I do see that this is a distinctively different license with a distinctively different scope of practice, whose educational pathway is distinctively different from the other licensees, while the LMFT, the LCSW, and the LPCC are, when I look at them, I look at different types of apples. I look at the LEP as an orange. It's a critical fruit. It's necessary, but it's not an apple. And so I'm very concerned that we are considering allowing them to supervise our other associates. And I guess the questions that pop into my mind are sort of, a lot of the other license types are taking classes like abnormal psychology, which focuses on diagnosing and understanding sort of how mental health disability impacts people's behavior and sort of cognitive makeup. Family systems theory around how do families function and work together to, how therapists work with families to sort of resolve family-related issues. There's the marriage and therapy, marriage and family, marriage piece, and how you do marriage counseling, and then there are other nuances of the other licenses that I haven't seen at this point that LEPs are trained in. A lot of what I see here is around educational evaluation that impact academic learning. That's important. The administration of testing, which is ultimately critical. I don't know what psychological counseling is for families and things of that nature. And so to me, I'm concerned about their ability to do that at this point. My experience as a practitioner has been to work in close collaboration with the educational psychologists who may have done specific testing through the IEP process to come up with a treatment plan. But from what I understand, the ASW, AMFT, APCC's role in that is to actually focus on the mental health component of the issues that arise from that IEP and working to resolve that. They aren't doing any of the academic stuff. They aren't doing any of the behavioral piece. They are doing working with the clients that meet medical necessity, and addressing those mental health issues. And so I'm just concerned that LEPs are not significantly trained to be able to work with our burgeoning therapists, because my scope of practice as an AMFT is not going to be in the pathway of what an LEP does. When I leave that setting, I'm going to go off and be a therapist. And I'm not necessarily convinced that this is a good idea at this point.
Betty?
So I'm going to respectfully disagree with my colleague. I feel like if you evaluate the course content on school psychology degree programs, there is a substantial counseling component with many of the variables that you're talking about. We do have counseling. Most school psychologists have counseling credentials. And I think what you're talking about in terms of a medical model, you're absolutely right. Psychologists are not trained in a medical model. And that's precisely why we're in a better position to supervise ERMS services, because an ERMS service is not based on a medical model. It's based on the educational model of impact on educational performance and functioning and outcomes. And I think school psychologists are uniquely positioned to be able to both assess. We do assess for learning disabilities. We do a lot of assessment, but we also assess for behavioral issues. We assess for mental health issues, and we are trained to intervene in the context of a school system, which is a different training background, granted, than a traditional marriage family therapist, but no less valuable and no less in-depth. And I think probably Chris or Heidi or someone could very clearly speak to the fact that our training programs do in fact have a robust component in all of the areas that Jonathan expressed a concern in.
I have a question, if I may. So Betty, is there any value with the discussion point that Roseanne provided in the setting arena? Is there any value in limiting this supervision to ERMS, or do you think that would be more restrictive?
So I think when you're talking about settings and where ERMS services can be provided, it to me, I believe the majority, my experience, and as a school administrator and an LEP, and I deal with this all the time, my experience is that the majority of ERMS services are in fact provided within the physical environment of a school. However, not all. And we do have contracted providers that are providing ERMS services in other settings. So I would rather defer actually to Chris or Heidi to address the physical setting piece of it, because I don't have really strong feelings about that. But what I can tell you is that the majority of ERMS services are in fact on a school setting, which is part of the problem, because the supervisors who are providing the supervision to the associates are oftentimes not located on a school setting. And so then there's a disconnect between the services and the needs of the student and the supervision and the feedback that practitioner is getting. They're kind of getting, I don't want to say mixed messages, but sometimes it is, because their supervisor is coming from more of a clinical medical model and not from necessarily a school model.
And so, and I guess, so, and I want everyone to hear that, and I will reiterate my esteem for the work that the LEPs do, and my experience with them has been nothing but stellar. And in my experience, most of the, and I go back to AB 3632, most of those services are provided on campus. The ERMS services are provided on campus. To your question, the ones that are not provided on campus because they're contracted out to community-based organizations, those organizations have supervisory structures where there are supervisors in their system that actually supervise those associates, so they would not need to be supervised on a particular campus. My experience is also that many school districts actually hire LCSWs, LMFTs, LPCCs who have the PPC credential, who are school social workers who could also provide supervision for these ASWs who are collecting hours on campus. Now, maybe in more rural areas where there may be limitations or access to licensed practitioners because people don't live in those areas, that might be a larger concern. But in the more urban settings, there are licensed BBS, LCSW, LMFTs, LPCCs on campus with the credentials who could actually provide this supervision, who would have the experience, who would have the sort of capacity to understand the nuances of a school classroom and provide that level of supervision.
So I don't think that this bill would suggest that if in fact there is another licensed supervisor on a campus, that they couldn't also provide the service, I think, or the supervision. I think it's more addressing the fact that not all campuses, not all school districts employ social workers. And they all employ school psychologists, many of whom are LEPs. It would provide increased access. It would make it easier for schools to recruit associates because we would have someone in place who could provide the supervision, and we wouldn't have to go out and look for or hire another licensee, such as an LCSW, LMFT, which is a huge cost if it's a smaller district, a smaller educational entity. They may not have those kinds of resources.
I have a question for Roseanne. So, so the language that is written now, does it allow the LEP supervisor to supervise outside school setting? Means that with our new supervision law, say like private practice. So can they actually go in to do private practice supervision?
Yes, there's no restrictions on the setting the LEP can supervise in.
Right. So I think that to me is, what we hear from the, from Chris and Heidi, was pushing for, for the, LEP to be able to supervise in the school for the ERMS programs. But now, but it looks like the language now is broadened to the way that it's covered, it can be qualified supervisor, to cover all areas. So I think, I have absolutely no doubt that, that the school setting, in the ERM setting, that they are definitely, a very valuable supervisor for that. But, but when we started to see that, it's, I think the discussion will be, should we limit it to just the ERMs or whether it should be broadened to every, to all settings? I think that's probably, would, address some of the Jonathan's concerns.
Right. That clearly would be a structured, organized, feasible compromise, that this be limited to the ERM setting, which we'd have to clarify would be the school setting. I would really, once again, I would not like to see LEPs in private practice supervising associates who are not providing ERM services of that nature, just providing some clinical supervision, because I think that's beyond the scope of what was initially written. So yes, that could be a compromise, but my previous concerns reiterated.
So maybe it's time to open up for, Chris or Heidi or whoever wants to come and give us some information or feedback.
Chris Jones with CASP. Where would you like me to start?
You got the mic.
So to address the concern, I guess, about the ability to supervise just in general. When we're talking about the scope of practice of an LEP, we're referring to educationally related mental health services. That's what we do. That is our scope of practice. Those services occur for the majority of the time in schools, but they also occur in private practice. I have a private practice. I've been in private practice for 13 years. Completely, 100%. So all of my clients receive educationally related mental health services because that's the scope of my practice. So I do employ interns. I have an MFT who is on staff to provide the clinical supervision for those interns because I'm not allowed to do that. If you think about it from a perspective that you just said, I should be able to provide supervision to the associates who are seeing my clients. It is my responsibility at the end of the day to make sure that their care is done is done appropriately. It is my business. It is my work, right? So I take responsibility for that, and I know that that's the way that the law is written. So that's what we follow the law. Remember, this entire question was raised because we had 2 LPCC interns who went through an entire year of providing services to students in a juvenile detention facility, working through the County Office of Education in San Diego, being supervised by an LEP who is a PhD and a professor, and none of those hours were counted. They thought that they were doing their due diligence and getting all of the right work done, and that is what initially raised the question. Who should provide the service? Who's the most qualified to provide supervision to interns who are seeing students for educationally related mental health services other than an LEP who has the bridge between both mental health and education? In response to our training is very extensive. Our training is, yes, directed towards schools, but the domains that we follow that are put forth by the National Association of School Psychologists has a lot of counseling, consultation, family, all of it. So, and I've got that information for you if you'd like to see it. With regards to our course of study, it's not just how to give an IQ test. It is using assessment tools to determine both learning and mental health issues, to collaborate with families, to provide counseling in school situations so that kids can access their academic programs. This is one of the bigger issues that we see when we have supervisors who are supervising ERMS-related services that don't have the educational background, because they lose the focus of, okay, well, how do we get this kid to the point where they're stable enough to be able to learn how to read, write, and do math when their home life is falling apart, when they've got whatever trauma that's happening. So we have to be trained in how to do that. So, it's an issue that, and I don't want to go on too long. When this first came up, I thought it's not a big, yeah, we can't supervise. We're LEPs. That's not what our role is. But as I've gone through this investigation for the last year and a half, it's actually become a very important issue, not just to me, but to the members of CASP. This is the right thing. This will provide more opportunities for interns to get quality experience. This will broaden the perspective if you have an associate that doesn't necessarily want to go into private practice but wants to work in the schools. Like they find that that's their passion. Well, now they have someone who can help them bridge the gap that they may not have received in their own training programs because they don't have that educational component. So now I've got to learn not only the therapy things that I've learned when I went through my schooling, but I have to learn about special education. I have to learn about how different disabilities are affected when a student is sitting in a classroom. I have to know that, whoa, you know what, this kid has autism. So therefore, you know what, individual counseling and therapy is not going to be recommended because research shows that that's not the best thing to do. Instead, what we're going to do is provide socialization training. We're going to work through the different things. I'm going to understand that when a child has an auditory processing disability, that they might not do so great in talk therapy because they can't process language. And how does that relate to how I'm providing services to the student? And now I've got a family that doesn't understand their student because of the disabilities. So now I've got to do a family component to help educate them and bring that unit together by understanding family systems. So we have the training. We have the training. Like I said, I've brought the evidence of it for you if you'd like to see it. I've brought some, I've included some different training programs in California from various universities across the state to show the different course work that we do that would, I think, hopefully answer some of your questions about whether or not we're qualified to do this job. But we're qualified, and I think it's important. So that's why we are hoping that you guys will recommend support to the full board for this bill.
I have a question. Don't go anywhere, please.
I brought my sleeping bag. I'm good.
No. So I want to say I appreciated the presentation that you made at our last board meeting.
Yes.
It was very informative, and it was very well done. Thank you. And I would agree about being qualified to function within the domains around how mental health disabilities are impacting sort of their academic performance. But I guess my question is, so the current process, in my experience, is that if a MFT, LCSW, PCC associate is providing services on campus and has questions, they typically will consult with the school psychologist, but still receive supervision from their primary supervisor. So I guess my question is, what is wrong with the current model of getting consultation around an IEP? Because when I practiced, I did that on numerous occasions with numerous cases. I would consult with the school supervisor about, I don't understand what an auditory processing issue is. What are my considerations when I meet with this? What sort of things should I tell the parent? What sort of things are you telling the parent when you meet with them since you wrote the IEP, blah, blah, blah. So I guess what's wrong with the current model of getting supervision from their supervisor and then consulting with the school psychologist on campus?
Well, I think that within our scope of practice and the services that we deliver, that we would be a more qualified supervisor in settings. Don't you want somebody that has the intimate knowledge of how all of this works to be supervising your associates?
Not necessarily. I do want somebody that they have access to, maybe that they can consult with to gather that information. What I would like them to have is a supervisor who helps them stay in the scope of what their license requires and the work that they may do if they at some point migrate outside of a setting.
Well, if they're working in a school, then that's the service they're providing, yes?
I would say they're providing related services. That's what they should be doing.
And so that's what they should be supervised on, correct?
I would say yes, correct.
Okay, so who would be the best person to supervise services if not an LEP, if that's their job to work in an program? School psychologists, so, and I don't want to throw the terms around like they're not the same thing, right? So if you have a school psychologist who's a typical building psychologist, right, they're not just doing counseling, they're doing testing and all of the other things, right? But when you have an LEP or a school psychologist who's working specifically in an program, that's all they're doing. That's their 100% of their job. They're not testing anymore. They're running that counseling program. So they have the training, they have the knowledge, they have the background to provide the best supervision for associates in that setting because they've already got the training. They've already done it. So if an associate is choosing to do an internship in a school or coming to work for me in my practice, wouldn't we be the best people to provide the supervision because we have the knowledge of both?
I guess my answer would be not necessarily, because if you have a client that potentially is in a school setting who is extremely traumatized, coming from a background of extreme sort of abuse or neglect, or whatever the challenge is, immigration issues, and the primary work in that setting with that therapist is to actually mitigate and resolve and address those issues, the LEP may not be the best person for that. They may actually need to be supervised by someone who actually has a scope of practice that's very much more aligned with what they're trained to do. So,
but is the implication that we don't have training in trauma?
No, that's not the implication, but you asked me who would be the best, and so that's why I answered it the way I did.
So Chris, very quickly, the intent is to allow LEPs to supervise associates that are working in an environment.
Yes.
That's it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, in yes.
Or providing that service.
So the way that we wrote it in the bill was providing services in educational or clinical settings because, in my practice, I'm basically a private person.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, I mean, because is the scope of practice of an LEP.
Right. So I guess my question for both you and Jonathan, if we were to suggest an amendment that the supervision is only applicable to associates that are working in an or providing services, whether it be on the school side or in your private practice, would that be amenable to you?
I think I would like more clarity about what an setting is. I clearly would support if they are providing it on the school district campus, yes.
Okay.
To me, that feels more structured and organized, along with a reevaluation of the number of hours that could actually be contributed toward their licensure. So, but I wouldn't necessarily want someone who's working in a CBO providing services sort of at the CBO's office being able to be supervised by an LEP. That's not something I would support.
So, are you saying that, if we clarify that services is the location, the mental health services being provided in the school, and that's become a little clearer and feel more comfortable?
And being supervised by by an LEP who is connected with the school or the school district, so that it's not so sort of, there isn't a lot of wiggle room. I mean, because
That becomes very restrictive, because if the services in a school setting, if the school setting doesn't have maybe an office or a site where they can provide that, then that child is going to need those services off-site. So hence Chris's private practice, where the child family goes to his office, they receive the services, and then they leave. So I guess my suggestion, because I understand the concerns and all the different nuances with the four professions, given that tends to be a more specialized practice addressed by LEPs, if we just limit it to, in an associate providing services can be supervised by an LEP, that sort of narrows where the type of service that they're providing, but it also seems to afford that associate quality supervision. And that would be my recommendation to the board. It's not to say that an LEP can hang a shingle on their outside and say, hey, now I do families and couples, so now I can supervise you. Because through all the discussions with CASP, that's not been their intent.
Sure.
It's been the intent to open up perhaps another arena for our associates to gain some hours, but then gain quality supervision at the same time. So I don't know if that, just restricting it to only, makes it, would align with what your concerns are or address those concerns. But I think in the discussion, that's where I think we might be able to find some kind of compromise. But I'm going to let Betty talk, because she's
Betty wants to say
the
something.
licensed.
Well, I don't know. I kind of understood that that's what we were asking for anyway.
That's how it's written in the
That's
bill.
how it's written.
Yeah, we have no interest in supervising outside our scope of practice. That's too much pressure. We don't want to do that. We want to do our job, and we want to help interns who are learning to wanting to do our job, do their job.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So that I don't know, and I defer to Roseanne or any of the legal experts here, but to me, it's written exactly like that.
I don't know that it necessarily
I didn't
is.
see
No, it's not.
No, that's
So
not.
If you
that's
look
not-
on page 6 of the bill, which is on page 112, this is the MFT law. It says a maximum of 1,200 hours gained under the supervision of a licensed educational psychologist. So that's one amendment. The other amendment that ties them in to the definition of a supervisor. They added them to the definition of supervisor on page, where did that go? On page 109, line 36, it adds LEP to the definition of a supervisor. So there's no discussion of the setting as the bill is.
Or the services.
And I think that has been in the, like the fact sheet,
Yeah.
and whatever summary things that we've provided, so it may, yeah, if that's not written into the actual bill, I don't know if it's, nothing is ever implied, right? We don't want to do that. But yeah, the intention would be to where LEPs practice within our scope to be able to provide supervision if it's appropriate.
So it might be helpful in this case, I'm sure there's a definition of ERMs in law.
There is. It's an
So
ed code.
It could, when we talk about the LEP under the definition of supervisor, there would probably need to be like a carve out saying that, you know, working in a setting as defined.
I'd caution against setting and talk about
Arms-related
Service.
services.
service,
Right.
not setting.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, ERMS is it's an educational definition, but you could call it educational psychology within the scope of practice of what we do. I mean, there's, you know, ERMS mostly is for students that are in special education.
Sure.
And I have clients that come in my office with kids that have disabilities or may not have disabilities that are struggling in school. They haven't been identified that I see for counseling to help them deal with whatever issues that they're dealing with so they can access their programs, but they're not necessarily on an IEP or they haven't been formally tested before, because parents don't always want their kids to be in the system. So we have to be respectful of that in, you know, with our clients.
So if we were to
So,
craft language that would specifically kind of address that, educational psychology or ERMS-related services.
and reduce the number of hours, to me, 1,200 seems substantial
Well,
for
it is-
someone who's not going to become an LEP.
Can I address as to why we chose that number?
Sure.
The 1,200 hours basically equates to a school year. Like if you're gonna work in a school setting, that you're gonna get about 1,200 hours of time in. So that would give, and that's how school districts work when they hire their associate or hire interns to do the jobs. It's for the year.
So how long? For 1 year? 1 year?
One
and will
academic
be-
year, one academic school year
Will
would
be
equate
equate
to
to-
1,200 hours of intern time. That's
Now
why,
that
that's
makes
why we
sense.
chose that number.
That
Yeah.
totally makes sense.
Isn't, so, but I don't know how accurate that is, because I know for every 10 hours of client contact, there needs to be an hour of supervision, and most students get 1 hour of supervision a week, so they can count 10 hours a week toward their license, so 10 times 4 is 40, 40 times 9 is 360, and so, you know, forget Christmas, forget Easter, you know, we're talking closer to 360, not 1,200.
Right.
There's 180 school days. Because we get all sorts of vacations. We get all sorts of holidays.
Right.
There's 3 weeks at winter, you get 2 weeks for spring break. You know, it's a Monday, they don't want to have
I got that.
classes.
We got
Right, yeah.
Right.
So that's in the model of all training programs, like NASP training programs, right? 1,200 hours is equivalent to 1 school year.
But I'm not sure that you heard me. So an associate for every 10 hours of client contact has to have an hour of supervision.
Right.
Most associates, no matter where they are training, get 1 hour of supervision a week. That means they can only count 10 hours of client contact toward their license. So that would be, hold on.
The ratios are not going to change.
No. I'm not saying that the ratios are going to change. I'm telling you how I'm getting to the number of about 360 and not 1,200. His 1,200 doesn't line up. If I'm getting an hour of supervision a week, I can only count 10 hours of client contact toward my license for that week. So if you multiply that by 4, that's 40. If you multiply that by 9, that's 360 hours during the school year and not 1,200. That's the only thing I'm saying. When you look at the math, it's not 1,200, it's 360. Unless they're getting above that amount of supervision, which my guess is if you're working as hard as most other people, there isn't a luxury to provide another hour of supervision or 2 hours of group.
I would disagree with that because school settings are different. We tend to work around a school day, and student contact time would be 6 hours of student contact time. it could be structured, and I think we acknowledge that that's the supervision level that's needed, but to assume that 1 hour a week is going to be what somebody receives in a school setting is not necessarily realistic, given the way our schools are structured. They could, in fact, receive quite a bit more supervision, possibly even on a daily basis, and often do, because they have that contact. After the kids go home, there's 2 hours left on that school day where you're going to be writing reports and evaluating things, possibly having supervision. So I think it's an artificial construct to try and impose something that's a clinical model that we're kind of used to into a school setting. Again, illustrating just the difference in those two practices.
My pushback would be is that we're talking about a lot of coulds and maybes and shoulds, but we don't know that that's the reality. And a lot of times, some of these associates who are providing the service aren't actually employees of the school district. So after they see their 2 or 3 clients, they may go back to their office and see other clients on their caseload. So not all of them have that capacity. So my final point will be, I think it's fair for us, if we're going to say that we will look at associates who are providing ERMS-related services, to come up with a better number that's based on some sort of concrete formula that allows us to have a number that's less than 1,200.
Well, it's just a maximum. They can get less, but they're not going to get any more than that. And
That doesn't change my concern
That's
that
fine.
that's too many hours for someone that's not,
Okay.
that practices and licensed in a different scope than the other ones.
But you would be willing to, if we restrict it just to ERM services, that's okay?
And then look and reduce the number, yes.
Okay.
So I think we talked about a lot about this, and and I'm not hearing any. I mean, the basic is that we agreed to move forward for that direction, that for LEP to provide supervision to the associates who are providing the ERM services. So the question now is really about how the regulation being written. So, so I'm thinking that maybe we need to round it up. So I'm thinking that maybe we can have a support position, and then, if amended, and be able to continue to work with, CASP and the author, office, to bring the board's, the recommendation of a committee, to incorporate, to whether it's the carved out language, to define, the services, so that, it can have a bit better, definition, about the supervision. Because, I'm also, concerned about, also, if it's written right now, then they expand, to basically LEB can provide supervision to any registrant, any of the the associates, that I have concern, because that's not what we talked about. And so, because, really, it's possibly just an unintended consequence. And so, so I would like to make that suggestion. And Roseanne?
Yeah, I think what is a potential possibility is that if you wanted to take a support, if amended, you could direct me to work with CASP.
Yes.
And we would probably need to bring the Ledge Council in to identify the definition of the ERMs. We're in that, it's probably an education code. So then we could work between me and them, and probably would need to ask Ledge Council for some help on how to craft that in there the best way, to come up with an amendment to restrict it to that setting, or to that scope, the service, not the setting.
And to look at a more feasible number of hours that will be provided.
I don't know that I'm in support of that.
Yeah, I'm not in support of that.
Well, I would point out that we don't restrict any other setting hours in any environment. The only restriction we have on the associates is that after that, with that second number, you can't work in a private practice. But we don't specify you can only work in a CBO or a mental health agency or in a private practice. We don't restrict their hours. So this could be perceived as being very arbitrary.
But I think that's incorrect, because I think, as has been noted, with social workers, there is a certain number of hours that a non-LCSW can supervise, and then there's a certain number of hours that are mandatory for a LCSW to supervise. So I think that's incorrect. I think we can and have legitimate grounds to be able to say, in an ERM setting, these are the number of hours that can be approved because it's already, there's already a precedent for it with social workers.
Christine?
I think, what was the numbers? 1,000, 1,200. I mean, I think that sounds reasonable if it's equivalent to a year. I agree with what Betty said, that it's set up differently. I mean, I don't think anyone up here has concerns about it respectfully except Jonathan,
And
so.
that doesn't make them illegitimate. That just means Jonathan's the only one articulating it.
So I think, yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, it's important that we hear different voices, because Johnson, you might represent some, some other, professionals. But I think, when Chris, you said that the 1,200 hours basically is calculated based on one school year, and that totally makes sense. Then I think there is a rationale behind, and I can take that. I think that's a good explanation.
So, and then I know we have to wrap this up, but I think he's looking at 1,200 school hours in a year. No therapist provides therapy all day, every day in a school setting. Nobody does that. It's based on the number of clients you see and the amount of supervision you get. I mean, there is a formula for how we do this. So I think it's, and I will reiterate, I'm okay with the ERMS-related setting component. I think we need to look at the number and base it on something concrete and not just there's 1,200 school hours in a year, because that's not realistic about what happens in practice.
So if it's not realistic, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, Jonathan, but if it's not realistic that they're going to achieve 1,200, is there any harm of capping it at 1,200?
Well, once again, I think the harm is that if we don't cap it, then it allows, let me think that through. What is the harm?
So I think the harm is, not necessarily the harm, but, one of the consequences is also, because of the portability, possibility that, it's a pretty big portion, so, and that, if the licensees, accumulate, that 1,200 hours and decided that they need to move out of state, and those, and that state doesn't accept, that clinical hours, that's the risk that, that the the registrant or the associate would run, would face, because it is a pretty significant portion, of their clinical hours.
Although I would go back to our portability bill, which is going to make that argument moot.
But that's for the licensed, already licensed in 2 years in good standing. We're talking about those, who might be, taking their, they're in the process of getting their clinical license, and yet they're not, receiving those receive their actual license yet. And because that would be, up to that state, to accept or not accept their.
And when I read all of the other states' requirements, I didn't see any reference to hours. It just said, could they be supervised by an LEP or not? It was just it was a binary choice, yes or no, but not a number of hours.
Well, the states, the individual states require their own number of hours, and then they go back and look at who the supervisor was if they're looking at that. Some do, some don't. So
yeah, and thanks for clarifying. It's not about the clinical hours. It's about the supervisor. Right. So if that, let's say the LEP supervise up to 1,200, that the associate accumulated, then if the other state doesn't recognize it, and that becomes problematic. So
it's a potential, but given that LEP is a practice that's pretty much specific to California, and if some of the other states have indicated if we have approved them as a supervisor, they would be willing to take those hours, I think the risk is minimum.
Well,
and it wouldn't be any different from a licensee coming into our state now, and we say, yeah, you've been licensed, but you don't meet 3,000 hours, so we'll give you credit for 100 hours every month, and you're going to have to make up the balance.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a, what I would, as a practitioner, what I would look at it, it's really about, the interest of the associate, to practice for the population. So in the school setting, it's actually a pretty, attractive, position because of the summer and stuff like that. And so, so I think, I don't feel that, that for the committee now that, that we have a majority dissent about the number of hours. I think, the most concern is really about, how do we clarify the setting, not the setting, service. Thank you. The service so that, we can actually have that be more specific and, have a little better definition for what the LEP supervisor can do. So let's move forward. I would like to, if there's no other discussion, then I would like to make a motion of, support if amended, recommend to the full board, and continue to recommend the staff, to direct the staff to work on the technical support, and, including the, what do you call it, the definition or
would be-
the carved out.
I think we support if amended and limit settings for LEPs to settings that provide ERMS services.
Firm services, yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. And
Setting, but
the ERMS
what ERM services is. We want a definition that says, what ERMS is, correct? Because it could be, the setting can be in a school or in an office.
Well, and
So you want to craft that for us, Sabina?
The motion or the
Yeah.
language?
Yeah, that too.
Well, I think Ledge Council, if apparently there's a definition in law, so I think Ledge Council can craft the language doing the, because it's kind of going to be a little bit, it's going to be a cross-reference, but.
Correct.
okay.
And then again, who knows what it might look like in May.
Yeah. Okay, so do I have a second? I made the motion already. And Betty second. Any other discussion about the motion or? Okay, please come up.
Had a quick comment about the scope of practice. So wouldn't the supervisor credentials or however they're getting licensed to be a supervisor take care of that? That they'll only be able to supervise within their scope of practice? Wouldn't, and so that's just a comment that the supervisor would be limited to only supervising in their scope of practice is what I think there. How when they become, whoever's taking care of the supervisor credentials, however you become a supervisor, I think you can only supervise in your scope of practice. That's just my comment. And I just comment that I think I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. In general, I think actually having different expertise, different fields of specialization, training each other, we actually all grow. Just my comment.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So any other discussion? Okay, I think we're ready for a vote.
I just need clarification on the
Sure.
motion. Is it a support if amended or support and provide technical assistance?
Support if amended.
Do we need to clarify that if it's amended to address the ERMS
Yes.
service, please?
Sure. Okay.
Right, here's roll call. Christina Wong?
Yes.
Betty Conley?
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox?
No.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. All right, so the next bill that we will be discussing, it's Senate Bill 10 in regards of the mental health services peer parent transitional age and family support specialist certification.
Yes. So this is another bill that we saw a very similar version of last year. It's run by Senator Bell again, and the Steinberg Institute and the Mental Health Service Oversight and Accountability Commission are the sponsors. And it would require the State Department of Health Care Services, DHCS, to establish a certification body for adult parent, transition age youth, and family peer support specialists. And then it would require DHCS to amend the state's Medicaid plan to include these providers as a provider type for Medi-Cal. So the bill would provide a definition of peer support specialist services, and it would require DHCS to establish a certification body by July of 2020. The certification body would define responsibilities and practice guidelines for peer support specialists, and it specifies certain things that would have to be included, such as trauma-informed care, co-occurring disorders of mental health and substance use, professional boundaries, confidentiality, things like that. The certification body would also need to establish a code of ethics, a process for certification renewal, continuing education requirements, and a process for individuals already employed as peer support specialists to obtain the new certification. And it states that the act does not imply a certificate holder is qualified or authorized to diagnose an illness, prescribe medication, or provide clinical services. The author notes that California lags behind the rest of the country in implementing a peer support specialist program. They state that the Department of Veterans Affairs, as well as 48 other states, either have or are developing a program. And we did some research last year when this bill ran to kind of show some of the requirements of other states' programs. So that's included here again for your reference. Touching on a couple of previous concerns, the board appears to outline a scope of practice this time for peer support specialists. A couple of versions ago it didn't. It's in the Welfare and Institutions Code 140.45.12 and 140.45.13. There's a definition of peer support specialist services. The bill doesn't contain the explicit language that we sometimes recommend about, not allowing services that fall under our specific license types. However, it does specify, as I just read, that the Act does not authorize the individuals to provide clinical services. So that might be sufficient. We can discuss that if you'd like. This version of the bill, unlike last year, does not mention supervision requirements for peer support specialists. They've deleted that. Past versions of the bill have identified acceptable supervisors, but they left out LPCCs last time. So we may want to discuss if the LMFTs, LCSWs, and LPCCs can be specified as acceptable supervisors. The bill still does not specify fingerprinting as a requirement. That's something that has concerned the board in the past. The board has considered similar proposals in recent years. Last year, the board took a supportive amended position wanting LPCCs to be listed as acceptable supervisors because they were left out, and wanting fingerprints. Governor Brown vetoed the bill, basically saying it's a costly new program and that he wanted a pathway for all current peer support specialists to become certified. So it was vetoed last year. The time before, it didn't make it to the governor's desk. So this is about the third attempt.
So we have been seeing this bill for a couple times now. So any discussion? So I can speak up a little bit too. I actually work in the drop-in center, work with the peer support specialist at that level all the time. And I really think that it's a good mechanism, to for one to give them, to give the specialist, a very good training and, and to, for them to also, learn, about, for that level of the services and the code of ethics and stuff like that. It's, and also, I think I said it again too, I think it also opened up a pretty good doorway, to, for the specialists to move up, to be able to, to get more specialized, of the mental health services down the road. And I think it's certainly, a good, quality control, mechanism. And the other thing too is, it may or may not be relevant, but I think, right now, because they're not, they don't have, they cannot bill Medi-Cal. So I think, by the certification and having, that level of a training, and that might be actually help the state, to be able to, not using, just the funding, but for them to be able to, to do some billable services.
Sure.
So, yeah.
I would agree. I mean, it's a great workforce development bill that really supports and clarifies the role of peers, which are critical in our systems of care. It also provides a career ladder for them to say, I have this baseline established certification, which allows them to move into their next educational path, whatever that may be. So this is a fantastic opportunity to really support people who are rebuilding their lives and also providing an opportunity for them to be build a career and support themselves and their families. So yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah, Betty?
So I just had a kind of a clarifying question. When I read this, one of the things we've talked a lot about in our exempt setting meeting is the fact that obviously there's no regulatory body that's supervising or regulating. would this allow something like that? Would this allow a process for people to have recourse if there was a problem?
As it relates to a peer support specialist, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
that seems like a really good thing that we were really kind of hoping. Okay.
Department of Healthcare Services would have jurisdiction, they would be certifying them, so they have to come up with various things to implement the program.
And this is-
Process for investigation of complaints and corrective action.
So that would offer much, significantly increased consumer protection.
Yes. The questions that Roseanne brought out is, that the committee might want to just confirm or revise is, are we comfortable with the current definition about the services? Because it talks about, I think, in the language clinical.
Yeah, it
or-
says they cannot provide, does not imply a certification holder is qualified or authorized to diagnose an illness, prescribe medication, or provide clinical services.
Is
So-
that enough for your comfort level that
The board was comfortable with it last year.
last time? So that's good.
It's on, well, in my analysis, page 129, it's 144.5.19, so let me find the page really quick.
Okay, I see. Number nine.
Yeah. The exact law, it says, this article shall not be construed to imply that the individual who is certified pursuant to this article is qualified or authorized to, and then provide clinical services as the last item. So it's on page 165,
Starting with line 3.
starting on line 3.
I'm wondering, based on your question, because diagnosing is just one part of sort of the clinical work product, which also includes assessment, diagnosis, and treatment planning. I'm wondering if it makes sense to add assessment and treatment planning to that, just so that it's comprehensive in its scope.
Yeah, what are your, legally, does clinical, because I don't know that clinical's defined, that's my only concern.
It's clear.
And that we had specified that it's under our act, which requires somebody to jump around. I like that this specifies, so authorized to diagnose. Yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts, Roseanne? And/or Sabina? I mean, if it's sufficient to say clinical services, then
I think our licensees provide clinical services, and assessment and diagnosis is under there, and it doesn't say assessment or diagnosis on this list.
Right, but it's part of that.
Right.
In your Practice Act.
Okay, so, yeah, then if the members are fine with it, I'm fine with it. I mean, I think we're good, but I just wanted to, since Roseanne called it out, I wanted to make sure that we're crystal clear good.
So the language on page 131, that language, it's the recommendation that we discussed in the prior meetings.
Right.
And
Yes.
it's not included, in the current bill.
We didn't recommend it last time. The board was okay with the way that it was written. They had decided. 'Cause I did call it out in my analysis last year. I just left it in this year because it's the same language, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's the one that, including 131 is just a little bit more specific. So, I mean, either one, yeah. So, okay.
So there's that, and then it talks about it didn't call out our
The
licensed
supervision.
supervisors.
It doesn't call
and
out
the
anybody as
fingerprinting.
supervisors. So, I mean, the DHCS would probably either run a bill or run regulations to identify that at some point. And then it doesn't require fingerprinting still, which there had been some pretty strong feelings about that last year, I know.
Yes, I remember that, yeah. So, so I guess that, if this bill, that's, looks like, we're moving towards supporting it. So, the discussion will be, whether the committee has a strong feeling that we need to, add the identification of supervisor and the fingerprinting, and then also clarifying the bill, with the more specific language, instead of just say clinical services.
Right. Well, and the other part of it is too, healthcare services is going to have to run laws and regs.
Yes.
To implement, and my guess is that might be a better time
To
to suggest the amendments. This is just to provide that certification pathway for peer support specialists.
And I think, given, hearing your concerns, any conversation Roseanne has with the office, she can bring those up and
Right.
maybe get more information for you guys for May
Yeah.
ahead of time.
So it looks like, it feels like that it's another, that support if amended position. And also, we can recommend to have staff to continue to provide technical support. Yeah. Support.
If,
Right.
Oh, okay. So we can do the straight support, and continue to provide technical support, or no? No tech.
with amendment.
Yeah,
Right,
no
support.
amendments, just straight support.
Right.
Support
Alone, and she's going to
And
work in the
then
background
provide
anyway.
technical support.
She's
Yeah.
going to do that anyway.
So yeah, it would support, and then I will work with the author's office to talk to them about the scope of practice, the identification of supervisors, get their reasoning behind it, and I'll report back in May, and then you can decide how you
Do
feel
that.
about their
Right.
answer.
Because then the board will still be making their own decision about
Right.
Absolutely.
their position.
Yeah.
So I would just like to support that, argue for that, because I think if we start adding amendments, it's going to slow down the process and derail what seems to be a really good bill and offers a lot of consumer protection. So I think we need to be strong in our support, and then, as you said, craft the amendments later.
So, yeah. Awesome. Any public comments? I forgot about that. We just talk and talk and talk. Mr. Grossman?
I have a question, and that is on page 129, the third to the last bullet point. It says that an adult or a family peer support specialist would need to take an approved certification exam. So who in fact is approving this exam?
That's going to be under the purview of healthcare services.
Right.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thanks.
Any other public comments? Okay, so I think we're ready for a vote and a motion, sorry, a motion. So I would like to make a motion to support this bill, to recommend to the board to support this bill.
I'll second.
And Christine second. Any other discussion? Okay, we're ready to vote.
Christina Wong,
Yes.
Betty Conley,
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox.
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so let's continue. So we have four more bill, and now it's 11:44. I'm getting so do we want to push forward the PDD? Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, so I'm fine either way. So what does the board want? So we can probably either,
I think we're going to, that other conversation around the autism stuff is going to be pretty extensive.
Right, so we could get our update on board-sponsored legislation and the update on the board rulemaking proposals, and then you can go to lunch?
sure. I just perceive it won't take long, right? Yeah, it's only take, yeah. Okay, so we can move it out of agenda. So let's talk about the update on the board sponsor legislation and also the board rulemaking, following. Yeah, it's just updates. Won't take long. So Roseanne, go ahead.
So the legislative update, the board is pursuing 3 legislative proposals right now. SB 679, the author is Senator Bates, and that is our license portability bill. We're working with the Senate Committee on Business and Professions. That bill is being heard in committee in the Senate Business and Professions Committee on Monday. So we're looking forward to that. AB 630, which is our required notice to clients bill. That the author of that is Assemblymember Lowe, and that bill was heard in the Assembly Business Professions Committee this past Monday, and it passed out on consent, so that's good. And then finally, we have our omnibus bill for the year, SB 786, being run by the Senate Business and Professions Committee. Some of it, they're still working on this bill. They put in some of our items. They still have questions on others. So this bill usually moves a little slower than regular legislation because it's not subject to the same rules. So we're continuing to work on that and answer their questions on that one. So it's moving forward as well.
So I just have a quick question. The license portability bill So any, feel about, what's going on? Are they, do you anticipate that it can, will pass through the legislature pretty smoothly? Or any
I don't want to
dissent
jinx
voices?
anything, but I think it's so far so good.
So far,
We
so
haven't
good.
had
That's
any.
all I need to hear.
Yes.
Yes, yes. I'm not telling you to,
Yeah.
I'm just.
Yeah, so far so good. We haven't heard any major objections. A couple of possible minor language tweaks that are basically non-substantive, but yeah,
The
it's
other-
going pretty well so far, knock on wood.
Knock on wood. And we had 3 other authors sign on to be co-authors. And so we have Republicans and Democrats moving this bill forward. So and we've gotten early letters of support.
Awesome.
So
That is a very interesting bill to watch. So, and thanks for the, Roseanne and Kim and whoever involved, for finding the author. That's, a lot of work. And so it's very excited. Yeah. So the next one is the rulemaking, and I believe it's Christy.
Alrighty, so we've got 3 regulation packages that are in the process. So the first one is the enforcement process, which are the AB 2138 regs. And, well, do you want to talk about what's going on with that?
The AB 2138 regs, I'm currently working on the notice and the initial statement of reasons. So once I am able to get that done, it will go up to Sabina for review and then move on from there.
The reg package on exam rescoring, application abandonment, and associate professional clinical counselor subsequent registration fee was noticed to the public on February 22nd, and we're having our regulation hearing on Monday, April 8th. And then that will begin, the formal process, and once we see what comments we get back, if any, because it was pretty minor amendments, so. And then our supervision regulations, I've just finished preparing the documents necessary, and they went to Sabina for the sort of a pre-review before it starts the DCA initial review process. Being these are pretty extensive regulations, we're expecting it may take some time. We're also wrapping in to that package our registrant employment in temporary staffing agencies into that regulation package, so that's gonna be added in there.
I'm hoping within 2 weeks to get any feedback back to Christy. I have board meetings coming up, so that would be the only delay.
Okay.
And the other, typically 2138, I don't expect more than a week on my desk.
Great.
It's going to be a little more than that on mine.
I'll be very excited to see that, push forward also. There are a lot of work, for that set of, what do you call it? Recs. I don't want to confuse like the statute and regulation and anyway. Okay, so thank you so much, Rosie.
Do you want to ask for public comment for items, just in case there's someone here who wants to leave?
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds good. So, any public comments for item not on the agenda?
Is the time to bring up something that I would like to put it for a future agenda? That would be the next item.
That would be the next item.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, we can do the next one as well.
Yeah, we can do it, So, okay, let's finish this one. Any other public comments not on the agenda? Good. And let's move forward for the suggestions for future agenda item.
Yes, so I would really like the licensing board to treat misleading claims of evidence-based therapy as false advertising. Currently, the label evidence-based is used indiscriminately, I would think, just to put a label of somehow it is scientifically proven to be superior. It's very misleading how or when this term evidence-based is used. So I've written up explaining how it is being misleading and false, and how it's actually misleading the public, and how it's also being used to explicitly exclude certain orientations that are effective, but the language, it's false narratives of the label evidence-based. So I have the actual definition and research done on how it's being misused. So I'd like to bring it up as a future agenda, because I don't know the process, how to get things. That's why I'm attending this meeting today, just to get familiar. but I'd really like to have the board look into this. I'm really very passionate about this.
Okay, sorry. I would suggest go ahead and leave everything you have with Ms. Madsen. She can talk, we're going to break right now for lunch, I'm assuming. You can leave everything with her, and that way, and your contact information.
Great.
And then she'll determine when it might be ripe to bring before the board.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other future agenda, suggestion for future agenda item? Okay, so it looks like, we don't have any other, then the time is 11:52. Let's break for lunch and come back at 1 o'clock. Thank you. We're hot now? Okay. All right. All right, I think we're ready. Okay, so welcome back to the Board of Behavioral Sciences Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. Now the time is 1:10 p.m. So let's move on to our next agenda item, which is the discussion of Senate Bill 163, the healthcare coverage for the pervasive developmental disorder or autism. So Roseanne, you're up again.
Yes. So this bill is very, very similar to one that was run last year. It seeks to close some of the loopholes that health insurance companies use to deny treatment for behavioral health, treatment for pervasive developmental disorder or autism. It also revises the definitions of a qualified autism service professional and paraprofessional. So existing law requires every health policy that provides hospital, medical, or surgery coverage to provide coverage for health treatment for behavioral health treatment for pervasive development disorder or autism. These healthcare service plans are required to maintain an adequate network of providers of behavioral health treatment. The law defines behavioral health treatment as professional services and treatment, including applied behavior analysis and evidence-based behavior intervention programs that develop or restore the functioning of an individual with autism. It needs to be prescribed by a licensed doctor. It needs to be provided under a treatment plan, and there's several other criteria. And then the treatment plan has to have measurable goals over a specific timeline. A qualified autism service provider has to be certified by a national entity. They have to be a licensed healing arts practitioner. They can be a psychologist, marriage and family therapist, educational psychologist, a clinical social worker, or an LPCC. And then there's also other levels of professionals. There's a qualified autism service professional that has to be supervised by a provider, and then there's the paraprofessional level, and they have to be supervised either by a provider or a professional. So this bill modifies the definition of behavioral health treatment. The new definition would specify that professional service treatment programs are based on behavioral, developmental, behavior-based, or other evidence-based models. So it expands it a little bit from ABA. They close a couple of other loopholes that are used to deny coverage about parent participation and things like that. And then it makes some changes to the definition of a qualified autism service professional. It specifies that they have to be under a direction of a service provider, and that they can meet one of certain criteria. So right now, they have to be classified as a vendor by a California regional center. This expands it a little more. It would somebody could qualify if they have a Bachelor of Arts or Science degree, and one of the things that would qualify them now is it brings our associates into the mix. So they could be an associate clinical social worker, marriage and family therapist, or professional clinical counselor. So it brings our associates in as one option. And then they make some modifications to the requirements for paraprofessionals as well. So the author is, their intent is they state that patients with autism are being denied treatment coverage due to loopholes in the law that require parent participation or location of service provider requirements. So they're seeking to kind of clean some of that up. Like I said, it would broaden the definition of professional to potentially include our associates. Last year, the board considered a substantially similar bill and took a support if amended position on the bill and asked that LEPs also be included as someone who can be a qualified autism service professional. However, on looking at the definitions and talking with the author's office, they noted that the LEPs are included with our license types as a provider. So including them as a professional actually would have the effect of downgrading them. So we probably don't want to continue on with that recommendation. The bill last year was enrolled, but the governor vetoed it, saying that he had just signed a cleanup bill the prior year to close some loopholes, so he didn't want to do it again. So.
Thank you, Roseanne. So, board member discussion, Betty?
So once again, this is an issue that I actually really care a lot about. Many of our families are on waiting lists for 6 months, a year, trying to get in-home behavioral support services for their kiddos. And part of that is the lack of providers. Sometimes it is some of the challenges with working families and having a parent in the home. There's some of that stuff that's really would really be good to address. Anything that facilitates families being able to access behavioral treatment is, I think, a great thing. I don't think in any way it compromises the quality of what's being provided. I had some questions about the evidence-based practices, but I think the greater good certainly outweighs the possible challenge of the evidence-based issue.
Just to clarify, also Roseanne, and thanks for Betty, for your opinion. So about the LEP thing, so right now the LEP is not included. So that was the suggestion from last year.
We shot ourselves in the foot on that.
Right. We
No,
looked
right?
at it, when we looked at it a little bit, the suggestion made sense, but when we looked at it as a whole, LEPs don't have an associate level. So they're included with the licensees, which they should be. But we asked for them to be included with the associates too, but they don't have an associate. So the author's office, in talking with them, they advised you don't want to downgrade them because then the insurance companies could require them to bill at a lower rate.
So this is a good note.
Right.
Don't include the LEP this time.
Right.
So board members, any other opinion, feedback, discussion? No? Okay. Public? Your comments regarding this bill? Okay, we're good to go. Oh my goodness. So last year we supported this bill, right? And so I don't really see any reason, why we should not continue to recommend a support position. So I'll make a motion. I'll make a motion to recommend to the board to support this bill, and Christine second, or? Oh, Betty second.
I'll second, yeah.
Oh, would you like to first? I don't
No,
know.
it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Just want us to vote on it. I don't
Yes,
care how we
right.
get there.
That's true. So any other comments or discussion about the vote? The motion, sorry. Okay, we're ready for vote.
Christina Wong?
Yes.
Betty Conley?
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox?
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Fly through this one. Wonderful. So the next one, SB 425, and it's about healthcare practitioner, licensees file, probationary physician and surgeon certification, and professional conduct.
Yes. So SB 425 is authored by Senator Hill. It's in response to some issues that made the news recently. So the bill would require health facilities and clinics, this is a mouthful, so bear with me, health facilities and clinics, healthcare service plans, or other entities to make arrangements for a healing arts licensee to practice there or provide care there, those entities would have to report allegations of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct by a licensee to the applicable licensing board within 15 days. And the reporting requirements would also extend to employees of these organizations as well. So under existing law, there are some reporting mechanisms already available, but they don't go this far. Boards under the Department of Consumer Affairs have to create a central file for all license holders. It has to contain information about any convictions in this state or another state, any judgment or settlement requiring damages over $3,000, public complaints, and any disciplinary action. The contents of the file, except for anything that's public record, is to be kept confidential. The law also requires organizations to make certain reports to the board if any of its licensees have certain disciplinary action. Insurers that provide professional liability insurance to our licensees have to report a settlement or arbitration that's over $10,000 if it results in a death or personal injury caused by negligence, error, etc., and it has to be reported within 30 days. Courts have to, within 10 days of a judgment of a board licensee committing a crime that's a death or a personal injury, if the judgment is over $30,000 and it was due to negligence, error, or omission, to report it to the board. And then the chief or director of a peer review body, a licensed healthcare facility or a clinic, have to report within 15 days after the effective date any staff person's privileges or membership is denied for a medical disciplinary purpose, if they're terminated for a medical disciplinary cause, or if they have restrictions on their staff privileges for more than 30 days in a 12-month period for a medical disciplinary cause. And then finally, the chief or director of a peer review body, a licensed healthcare facility or a clinic, has to report to the licensing agency within 15 days after a final decision. It has to be a final decision or recommendation of disciplinary action following a formal investigation. And it has to be a formal investigation that determines that any of the following 4 things have occurred. If there's incompetence or gross or repeated deviation from the standard of care, any prescribing, dangerous prescribing of controlled substances, any acts of excessive prescribing, and then also any sexual misconduct reports. But then again, that is only after a final decision or recommendation and after a formal investigation. And it does not require the peer review body to make that report if there's no final decision or recommendation. And so this bill would require a report due to any allegations, and it's any healthcare service plan or any entity that employs our licensees. A willful failure to file a report is punishable by a fine of up to $100,000, and any failure, non-willful, is punishable by up to $50,000. And then the applicable licensing board that gets the report is required to investigate. So this was brought to light because there's some legal loopholes that the author is concerned about that can allow a practitioner with repeated sexual abuse allegations to keep practicing at a facility for years without their licensing board being notified. And what happened was there was a 2018 report by the LA Times that reported that there were multiple unresolved complaints by a gynecologist at USC who had worked there for about 30 years. None of the complaints had been reported to the medical board. In response to this, Senator Jerry Hill held a hearing to examine the issue on hoping to kind of find out some more information. He found that there's a lot of different reporting standards for different agencies. Some facilities have no requirement to report. Some have a peer review group that reports if they come to a final decision and things like that. But sometimes they don't come to a final decision on these kind of investigations. And in the attachments, I've included the outline for Senator Hill's committee hearing, and that explains some information about the 805 reports, the requirements to report. The reason that a final report isn't guaranteed is that different peer review bodies can have different standards, and also sometimes they have confusion about the law, or they don't end up making a final decision. They settle it some other way along the way. So this bill is expanding that reporting requirement significantly so that any allegation has to be reported. One question I had, which I posed to the author's office, is that board licensees practice in a variety of settings. So they call out health facilities and clinics, and then they kind of give a definition. They kind of say, or other entities, which includes schools. So I asked them to clarify what they intended other entities to be. Is that any place where a board licensee practices? And they indicated that their intent is to ensure that all instances or complaints of sexual misconduct be reported in any setting, anytime a licensee is seeing a patient. But the bill, it just kind of says, or other entities. So given the steep fines that are associated with the failure to report, the committee might wish to discuss whether the reference to other entities in section 805.8A and B and C is sufficiently clear. In terms of how this would affect the board, we discussed this with our enforcement unit. It could result in an increase in complaints. There's really no way to know. There probably will be some increase in complaints. We did not put a fiscal impact on it because, number one, it's unknown how many complaints we would get. Number two, when we get these type of third-party complaints, a lot of times the victim doesn't want to participate, which means there's a lack of evidence. So we believe that the caseload, we could absorb it within existing resources.
Any discussion from board members?
Yeah. I mean, I had questions. I mean, I guess the
Yeah,
first one
go
is,
ahead.
what would the board be required to do when someone makes this report? Like, so, okay, somebody makes an allegation against someone, then what? Like,
We would investigate, just like any, because that's what a complaint is. It's an allegation.
Sure.
Yeah, so we would, if it's a simultaneous investigation, we may wait until until that conclusion, or we may run it parallel with that. So, but if we receive the allegation, we're obligated to look at it.
So this will be sort of, if I'm understanding right, that this will be a similar process as if someone called and said, okay, my therapist had sex with me,
Right.
and then you would open up a case and.
Right.
So there would be a financial impact.
Well, I mean, potentially you could have an increased caseload. Right now, we average about 1,100 consumer complaints annually. Staff carries an investigation caseload of about 30 to 40 cases. You might see a slight increase, but I really think it's just going to be minor and absorbable, quite frankly. And if we find that it's other ways, then then we have the documentation I need to request an additional position.
Okay. And then I guess just one more question I had was, is I didn't necessarily see where sexual misconduct or sexual abuse was defined. I mean, is it a concrete set of behaviors or activities?
No, it's just any complaint of it, any allegation.
And to be clear, we get a lot of complaints that don't lead anywhere, only because understand that this is going to come from a third party.
Right.
So we would need information as to who the victim may be, and we would have to seek that victim's permission to, not conduct the investigation, but at least contact the
Cooperate.
treating licensee, unless the allegation involves some type of arrest by a law enforcement or entity, and then we can investigate from that angle.
Okay. Thank you.
Betty?
I'm not sure how to articulate my concern with this. And I think it has to do with that third party reporting an allegation. Just seems so loose to me. And the penalties for not, and who I mean, I don't know. It's absolutely a noble effort. I'm also concerned that if someone is making allegations and it's only being investigated by a local board that may have bias or interest, that could alter the findings, as obviously was the case in that one situation. But to put such an onerous fine on someone, on a third party who fails to report an allegation of sexual misconduct, I mean, boy, that, I don't know, does anybody else feel like that language is just a little... And when I read that, I went, it's a great idea.
Yeah.
I'm just a little worried that we may have unintended consequences. I don't know. I'm hesitant to say that I'm in a opposition of the idea. I'm just a little concerned about willful, but $50,000 for an unwillful. I mean, that was the one that got me. Unwillful failure to report an allegation of misconduct. I mean, that's pretty loose.
I can offer that this bill is scheduled to be heard in Senate committee on Monday. So the committee analysis is not out yet. We could, watch the bill until May and see what it looks like then.
So it seems to me that, this is really pointing to those health facilities, who have that peer review, to determine, and make recommendation, to really kind of like tighten that part of it. Because, the pre-review, it really becomes problematic because, based on, what Roseanne said, that, they have to have a formal decision before they can proceed to report to a licensing board. So to us, as the mental health professional, I don't think we have that peer review process. But at the same time, I can see why, but I'm not sure if the intent of the bill really is kind of applicable to us. I mean, I'm kind of like Betty, it's just kind of like, I see it, but there's something not, that I'm just, I don't know about the implementation, because even though they might directly, refer to the board, but it's allegation. It's not a conviction yet. So I don't know how much the board can actually do, apart from just collect, have a file open and do our own investigation. So, I mean, meant well, hefty consequences, and yet, I'm not sure, how much that we can really change for our particular licensing.
Christina? Why don't we just wait until May and just kind of see what happens and some of the comments that come out of that, and then talk about it with the whole board? We know more what this is going to look like, if anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because all the other boards are looking at it too.
I was going to say, no, I agree with that. And I guess that third party, I'd written a question down here. I know when there's actual sex between a therapist and a client, the client has to report it. We don't even allow other therapists who know about the situation to report it.
No, they can report it. I just can't, it makes it very difficult to investigate because, again, we need the client's permission. Because otherwise I can, if the allegation was against you and I didn't have the client's permission, I could send you a letter and say, Dr. Maddox, could you please, provide this in detail? And you're going to tell me, oh, no, that never happened. And then it's closed, whether it did or it didn't.
So I was thinking, so with that example sort of dovetails with Betty's concern that these third-party reports, and it's really not clear, and I think it subjects people to.
Right. Right. I mean, we get the 805 reports now, and those are finished, completed, and so then we're able to really jump on the investigation at that point, because, and that seems to me reasonable.
So, in answering, Roseanne, you raised a concern about any other entity, because I think that's also, a very important point to discuss. And I take a look at the bill, it looks like, they really are trying to cover everybody, including exempt setting, including, private practice, schools, and private corporation, and anything. So I'm good with that, if it's just broaden the entities. So.
And I like waiting.
Yeah, no, I like the waiting. I'm just, yeah, absolutely.
So maybe, I don't know how we would formally do this, but maybe after they have is it hearing next week?
Yeah.
Maybe if it looks like it's going to go forward or whatever, that could Roseanne just talk, like, we need this tightened up. Who are these other entities? Could she talk with the authors.
I can do that.
Technical assistance.
Yep.
Again.
Exactly.
If, if the other boards are looking at that, I'm sure that, they will have, many
Right.
input also. And many boards may be taking a similar approach and.
I think there will be a lot of input on this one, so that it's going to be an ongoing process throughout the legislative session, I would imagine.
Okay. So if we, it sounds like we want to take no position for now and we just watch.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Comment?
Public comments, sorry. Thank you. Any public comments? Yeah. Okay, so we're good. So we can actually move forward for the next one. So the next one is SB 601, and it's about state agencies and the fee waiver.
Okay, and for this one, you should have gotten an updated version of the analysis. The version should be dated March 28th, 2019. Does everybody have that? Okay, and then for members of the audience, if you didn't grab it, and you'd like to, there's a copy on the back table there that you can have. So, because this bill was amended after we sent out the packet. SB 601 has to do with state agencies and fee waivers for certain licensees. It would allow the board to reduce or waive fees for a licensee or registration or a renewal or replacement of a physical license if the licensee or registrant can demonstrate being affected or displaced by a state or federal emergency. So California law for California emergencies has three different types of emergencies. There's a state of emergency, a local emergency, or a state of war emergency. So that's one thing that exists in the law. And then, of course, we have all of our fees that the board requires to be paid for various things that's in the law. Optometry board actually has something in their law that allows them to waive an application fee for somebody who's been affected by a federally declared emergency if they can't relocate within a certain amount of or a reasonable amount of time back to their state, and it's causing them an economic hardship. So this bill would permit a state agency to waive the fees or to reduce them if the request is done within 1 year of the proclaimed emergency, and the requester can demonstrate to the satisfaction of the board that they've been displaced or affected. The author cites, of course, the recent Camp Fire, and also there's been some fires in Southern California, and there was the Napa Fire. And so these disasters affected about 381,000 businesses, and many of those individuals were licensed, and they needed to replace licensing documents. And the law is generally silent, except for Optometry Board, about what we do in that situation. And so that's where this bill is coming from. In terms of a potential fiscal impact, it's really difficult to predict what fiscal impact it would have on the board. Like, it's probably, if it's a limited area, it's probably just going to be a handful of licensees or maybe 100. If it was a giant statewide emergency, though, that could get to be having a significant fiscal impact. So that there is kind of that thought. But the bill is permissive, and so it doesn't require us to do that. It's kind of a judgment call. If the bill were to pass, the board might need to consider regulations to determine the process to request a fee waiver, and also to determine acceptable proof of being displaced or affected, or the board could just decide to leave the decision to a case-by-case basis. So it could be done probably either way. So I'll open it up for discussion.
So I truly, truly appreciate, this bill, just knowing, just being so close, with the Camp Fire victims, and knowing a lot of the, the licensees and registrant came and say, I lost my license and how can I do it? And they already lost everything. So I truly, support this bill, and I think it clarified, the kind of the parameters, and clarify that the board has that ability, to waive the fee. So. And it looks like, if that moves on, we still have to figure out, how actually implement, that. So
it's not hard.
It's not hard, yeah.
And I think if I recall correctly, I have the discretion to waive a fee anyway. So, which we did for those individuals that could demonstrate that they were affected by the fire. I mean, it was pretty easy documentation. And then we could actually, I mean, they had site maps that we could look at to verify that we're getting accurate information. And so most of them were seeking a replacement license, which is $20. And, you know, I wanted to be the least, I just felt like it was the right thing to do for those individuals. And we don't need the $20 that badly, quite frankly. So, you know, for some boards who maybe feel like they don't have the authority, I mean, I think it's a good bill in terms of how it would affect how we do it. I would do the same thing again.
Board members, any other questions? Christine?
I don't have a question, but I think we should support it just for the
Yeah.
other boards, you know.
Public comments? All right, so it looks like, you know, we are in support. So you want to make a?
Sure. Move to recommend to the board that we support this bill.
I will second that. So any other discussion? Okay, we're ready.
Christina Wong?
Yes.
Betty Conley?
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox?
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach? Motion carries.
Thank you. So now the next one is SB 660, and it's regarding post-secondary education mental health counselors.
Yes, so this bill is another bill that we saw last year. The author is Senator Pan, and it would require certain higher education entities in California to hire one full-time equivalent mental health counselor per 1,500 students enrolled. And it would require it would be the California State University system and the community college system that would be required to do this. It would be a minimum requirement, so they could hire more if they felt needed. It provides a definition of a mental health counselor as being someone licensed in California. And it would require some reporting information so that there is more data on mental health at college campuses and for those particular state systems. The author states that the International Association of Counseling Services recommends one full-time equivalent mental health counselor for every 1,000 to 1,500 students. There's evidence that the UC system is meeting this, but it's estimated to be significantly higher in the CSU system, and there's not a lot of data, so it's hard to know exactly what the ratios are because there's that lack of reporting. So this bill would add that reporting and the requirement. The board may wish to discuss a couple of things. The bill has a definition of mental health counselor, which is just people who are licensed by applicable licensing entities. Wasn't too much of a concern about that last year at the board level. There was more of a discussion of the second bullet point, which is, should associates and trainees be included in that definition of mental health counselor? Last year, the board took a support if amended position on this bill. The board had requested that in addition to licensees, trainees and registered associates also be permitted to be hired to meet the ratio requirement. Governor Brown vetoed the bill at the end of last session. He stated that the requirement should be made within the government budget process, and that specific ratios should remain within the decision of the campuses.
So, board members, discussion. So we talked about that last time, and we supported the bill, and we talked about, you know, the racial and the requirement. And so I really feel that, you know, considering the amount of suicide, you know, happening in college campus, you know, this is a good initiative, to help bring the mental health services, on campus, and also, to give them a little bit more sessions, instead of, just doing crisis intervention.
Sure.
And so I would love, I would love to support the bill. And in terms of, whether it should be specified, for which licensing board and whether trainee and associates, should be included. I think, we talked about it last time that it should be included. And so I think that would be, we can, I would love to specify, say like a certain board instead of, there's not that many boards that can provide mental health services anyway. So maybe a little more specific is good, not, it's fine too, you know. That's just my opinion. Board members?
So no, I would, I think, so I support it. I guess my only concern is that it uses the language of hiring and also connects the word trainees to it. Trainees can't be hired because they're students in school. And my personal opinion is that trainees should not be included in that ratio because they're fundamentally a different category of mental health practitioners. They're in school, they're learning, they're very inexperienced, and so I'd hate for them to be counted in the ratio toward people who are supposed to really work toward mitigating mental health issues that arise on college campuses. They should be seen as students who are gaining experience, gaining competence, and while they're on campus, that's great. I mean, they can train there and be there, but they shouldn't be counted in that ratio because we should be looking at people who can actually be hired as staff on a campus, which would be a post-graduated associate or a licensed staff. So I think trainees should be extricated from that and seen as a special category of because they're students.
I agree with Jonathan. That makes perfect sense.
I agree as well. I was going to bring that up as a concern, that trainees shouldn't be counted as part of the.
So I think, you know, my understanding is some of the campuses actually, you know, have the interns, you know, you know, their counseling center actually is one of the sites that provide, you know, internships for those students. Yeah.
That's fine. That can be a training center, but they shouldn't be counted in that ratio.
In that ratio thing.
Because they're transitory and they're very inexperienced and they're learning and growing in their clinical capacities, and so they shouldn't be qualified in that.
Right. So they can have the internship but not counting at the ratio.
Correct.
Yeah, it's just a ratio issue.
Yeah, it can be a training center. If they
I
want.
could see institutions easily skirting this requirement by just saying, oh, all our trainees are providing that. And I agree with Jonathan. Those are valuable experiences, but they shouldn't replace a license, whether that's an associate level license or because an associate's going to have the supervision of a supervisor.
Mm-hmm. So, yes, Roseanne?
I'm hearing that we want to ask for an amendment.
Microphone.
All right. Hearing that we want to ask for an amendment that they're licensed or registered in California by Board of Behavioral Sciences, Board of Psychology, spell out the boards, but don't ask for the trainee amendment.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Sounds good to me. Yeah. So if that's the, you know, that's a suggestion. Okay, public comments. Any public feedback? Nope. Okay. So
I make a motion to support, if amended, that we would have mental health counselor be defined as a licensed or registered associate on the BBS board or Board of Psychology, but separate or remove the trainee status.
I'll second that. Me, Christina. So any other comments? Okay, we're ready to vote.
Christina Wong?
Yes.
Betty Conley?
Yes.
Jonathan Maddox?
Yes.
Dr. Christine Whitlisbach?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. So I think this is the last bill that we need to discuss. And so that will conclude our Policy and Advocacy Committee meeting. The time now is 1:47 and we're adjourned.